Okay, guys, I'm very sorry. What happened is that I had a major crash due to the usual shit. So I have a incoming call or whatever, and it simply crashes the space. So I would like to apologize for everybody who connected and went on. I'm going to do a review, fuck off about the experience part, but basically I started to do my own stuff because I was unhappy with both sides. On one side, I would understand why the Russians would not communicate something else than just gains and bullshit made up numbers of losses or whatever. But on the Western side, my point was that I would have hoped for something more credible, because that's what the trend response is for the Western academics or post-academics. So basically, they are more believable because they get ethics and shit like that. This war proved me that I was right to doubt this nonsense, because since the beginning, as I said, they have been dog shit. They have been dog shit, and it's normal because they have completely overlaid their ethics and, I'd say, not fairness, because it's not about fairness, but at least factuality. Most of the Western analysis, by some people, as I said, like Bill Rojo, who in March already had said, listen guys, Ukrainians are saying that if the Russians mobilize, it's going to be shit for them, because time is on the Russian side. Russia took, of course, much time to mobilize, and we know what happened. They reached a low point with a double failure at Kharkov and Kherson, but they had already failed in Kherson, as I already explained, by failing to get Nikolaev. Nikolaev was the gate to go into Odessa, which was going to be a lot more problematic for the Ukrainians to defend. Once the Russians had spread to Odessa, the Ukrainians would have gone in way too many directions, even with the abandonment of Kyiv, Chernigov, and so on. But let's go back to RUSI. Basically, as I said, with RUSI we have a huge problem because, first of all, they are trying to, in my opinion, cover the asses over the bullshit they spewed from probably November 2022 to up to May 2023. It starts with the fact that they're using, as I said, Ukrainian General Staff database and values, which they themselves said it's not the perfect, and it's not accurate, or they think it's not 100% accurate, but they don't have the choice because that's the only company that I said they can have. This is a lie, of course, because, as I said, I've done my own analysis last year on how the Russians reduced their losses and managed to organize their troops in order to both defend their gains in Zaporozhye and Bakhmut, now under firm control of Russian forces, but also have this creeping offensive that helped them divert a large amount of forces, up to 20% of the counter-prepared forces in 2023, in order to both reduce the capability and readiness of the Ukrainian forces attacking Zapo, Kherson, and Bakhmut, but also make gains that would put the whole maneuver for the Ukrainians in threat. And that's why suddenly they were 6 kilometers from Kupiansk, and suddenly Ukrainians had to completely change their modus operandi. And I think above Bakhmut, which was literally a blunder, the fact that Syrskyi chose to attack Bakhmut, and I'm going to go that deeper into the analysis itself, because Syrskyi didn't make a mistake. Syrskyi understood the game. What Syrskyi tried to avoid was exactly what is happening right now. Right now, the Russians have never been so close to completely checkmate the whole effort for the sister cities, and they are not closer to Konstantinovka than they could have been in 2022. This is how easy it is. What is going on right now is a statement of intention towards Syrskyi's plan, which was absolutely correct. If you see on the losses that have been recovered by the Russians, the huge gap between the canal and um, the southern part of Chasov Yar going underlying towards Konstantinovka has not been recovered. Yes, Klishivka has been to a certain sense, but you get this about 40 square kilometers that are still to be retaken and are a dangerous space for the Russians themselves. This, in a certain sense, is how, when you read the RUSI preview or review in this case, you need to think with a form of empathy. Why would Sirsky blow up that much? And it's pretty simple. That guy saw exactly what we're seeing right now. If there was no defense of the southern salient, if it was evacuated and better positions were taken, in this case already by February 2023 in Chasov Yar, then what we are seeing right now, which was the complete breakdown of the defensive line on that direction over the course of 4 to 5 months, would have been just the Canal micro-district towards Chasov, so the Russians would be in Chasov right now. And the analysis itself, so as I said, first of all, they say that the planning was sound, or the fundamentals were sound. This is not true. I already made a allegory with a house. If I made a good plan, and everything is fine, studies of feasibility, fundamental on structure, integrity, and so on are good, there are only a few things that can go wrong. And first of all is the funding, or the availability of means. In this case, they asked for it, and they got, sorry to say, more than they asked. At least that's what Zaluzhny said. Zaluzhny asked for 1,000 pieces of heavy equipment, got 1,500 to end up with. What kind of equipment he had, that's a secondary discussion. Second is, I cannot build my house, despite everything being perfect and having the money, because I don't have the crew to build it. And the manpower is the second part. And the third, the most important part, is that it's a dream. All this fucking plan, all this shit, I made it up. Nothing was feasible. I fed up false information to my allies who are going to pay for my fucking house, and I run up with the money. In this case, running up with the money is literally presenting a con plan to my allies, in this case NATO and France, based on lying on how I got Kherson and Kharkov back. And this is, I think, the point that I made in May 2023. The account that made that is gone right now, but this article was about a three-pointer that was hubris on both sides. So basically, Americans had this hubris based on what they saw in Kharkov and Kherson, to say that Russians are stupid, they're going to flee. Second part is that Ukrainians actually lied and hid the real scale of losses. And in a sense, we can have that impression by now learning that already by the end of 2022, they had more than 30,000 irrecoverable losses. Whereas our friend, the Coke man, came up in February 2024 saying only 31,000 people have been killed. 31,000 Ukrainians have been killed. This, of course, everybody knows was nonsense, because over 2 months before he made that declaration, we were privy to a project called UI Losses, which already showed over 40,000 killed in January 2024. And of course, the same people who were managing the project said, this is nothing, this is a drop in the ocean. There are more losses we cannot have for many reasons. The parsing of information, the non-ability of being on the spot, like, for instance, BBC and Mediazona has. They can go and visit cemeteries in Russia, and they, of course, have people on the inside giving the information wrong or false or right or correct. We don't know. We have to, check step after step. But the thing is that the database given to the allies at the Rammstein format was obviously wrong and was obviously made up. How much was it made up? In my opinion, half of the shit that were telling to the Allies was bullshit. And the most important part, as I said, is that from the day one when they came out and announced losses of 3,500 killed, I personally had a breakdown. I'm going to tell you guys, like, for like 15, 20 seconds, I'm like, what the actual fuck? How can this guy, because it was Zelensky who went up and literally, cited his numbers, and nobody asked the thing. Everybody ran with it. And by roughly end of October, November, even the Ukrainian general staff started stopping with these invented losses, because they were basically giving like 2,000 casualties one day, then 900, then 500, then 300. And every time it was killed persons, I'm like, wait a little bit. By this tempo, given what you discussed about the invasion force, which is basically between 2 and 300,000, you just killed off 1% of that force the first day. And in worst case scenario, 2% of that force. Like, just how is this even possible given the level of destruction on both sides, but especially the losses of capital objectives on the Ukrainian side? One of the things that a lot of people ignored, because Ukraine had to win, is that the first 7 weeks of this conflict were extremely costly. Now we're discovering, thanks to the posthumous awards that the Ukrainians were getting, that probably the very first day, Ukrainians lost 1,000 killed in action, based on the usual values of these posthumous awards. And it's normal. It was a kind of decapitation strike that was tried by the Russians. It failed, of course. Otherwise, we wouldn't have this discussion now. But from the beginning, there was this projection. From the beginning, there was this false data feeding, which we still keep going right now. But initially, there wasn't this going along with it from the Western perspective. People like Bill Rojo, as I said, already threw some spanners in there. A couple of journalists. There was one Flemish journalist from the beginning of the war who spelled doubt on the numbers that Ukrainians gave about the attacks on the Nikolaev barracks, when the Ukrainians went with a very low casualty, initially 40, then 80, while the guy was already at the Nikolaev morgue, and people said, like, the first few minutes, they got 114 bodies, all Ukrainians, and then by the end of the day, there were already 170 bodies in there. So the problem with Ukraine from the beginning, and problem with Russia as well, I mean, like, let's not be stupid here, is that they went along with a war on truth when it came to the operational losses, gains, and status. And the best example for this is that by June 2022, the Ukrainians were begging for artillery, equipment. I can post the June 20th request from the head of the procurement and logistics in the Ukrainian military, which asked for a force of about 68 to 80,000 people worth of equipment, tanks, APCs, artillery, and he said it clearly. On some sectors, we have 50% plus losses. So what would that be? In my opinion, air defense available. Sorry guys, it cut a little bit. So air defense available, artillery probably available, ammunition available, because the thing is that Ukrainians were firing as hell. And by May already, the signs of Ukrainians losing this equipment was visible, because we had these images of guys going around with trash trucks, earth movers, with a couple of dozen rounds, whereas they would need probably at least 100 for their positions in defense. So overall, a lot of things that were done by the Ukrainians were obviously wrong. They were lies. And this allowed a lot of Russian commentators to start laughing about the real extent of Ukrainian capabilities. This, of course, as we learned, was wrong. And a couple of movements that were done already were obviously visible. The attack on Chernobyl, so basically the Kherson International Airport, which cost the Russians probably between 15 and 25 helicopters, plus ancillary equipment and so on. So all these things already indicated that Ukrainians were no pushovers, but the investment that the Ukrainians did was a hard sprint in order to contain the Russians, force them to review. Of course, Ukrainians themselves had I think, clearer picture on what the Russians wanted, given how fast Putin wanted to negotiate a deal, which, in my opinion, was, of course, wrong, given what he had already started. And this turned from bad to worse once the Ukrainians smelled blood in the water and literally turned the whole negotiation process against Putin by, as I said, first of all, negotiating but restarting encounters in Kherson and in the Kharkiv-Sumy axis. After that, once the Russians were obviously reaching, quote-unquote, a deal, they wanted to cut their losses, or at least the political elite wanted to cut their losses, to a point that I personally would have been baffled. But once again, this is what the Western press allegedly communicates. And we end up with the situation where the Ukrainians now have something to show off to everybody, and on that part I would half-assedly agree with RUSI that the way Ukrainians led their defensive war prompted the allies to say, okay, maybe these guys have a chance. So this whole con was well played on the Ukrainian side, but it would have long-lasting effects on later on. As I said, first of all, it would help blow the American hubris over the Russian incompetence and absolute lack of fighting skills, whatever you want to call it. Two, it would help the Ukrainians hide the reality of their own losses and hide the reality of what they have to overcome. And three, as I said, the Ukrainians had no experience fighting against an entrenched enemy. The few experiences they had on the Kherson area were dramatically bad. As I said, when they restarted the counteroffensive the 16th of March, they took about 45 days to march almost 20 kilometers from the limit of the Nikolaev Oblast towards the Ingulets. And then in 2 days, a Russian counteroffensive pushed them back 10 kilometers because of the logic of the Kherson Oblast, which is, as I said, a huge part of it is tundra. And you don't have much choice but to die there. So either you go fast and take territory, either you get a kind of replay with the Sinai Peninsula, where basically you cannot hide if you don't have air dominance. And that's what happened to the Ukrainians. Then a lot of things changed, of course, because, as I said, the whole plan for Kherson was to have it as a springboard for Nikolaev, and once Nikolaev was gotten, then dislodging the Russians from there and also stopping them from crossing towards Odessa would have been mission impossible for Ukrainians with the kind of forces they had. So in this case, as I said, the first point, blow the Americans' ego. Second, hide their own losses and hide their own incompetence. And the third part, which was the most important, get everybody in the same car, let's say it like this. Because I'm pretty sure that the Germans themselves, and we had this discussion before, when the Germans said we don't want to give our Leopards, we'll give our Leopards to the Americans, to the Abrams. Why would the Germans say that if they were convinced about the Ukrainian planning? And the thing is that a lot of these guys knew that what was being built by the Russians as a defensive force, they had already seen this in Kherson beyond the Dnieper. And it was already a fucking huge problem. Some areas towards Kryvyi Rog took months and months of heavy bombardment, HIMARS, pinpoint strikes, artillery concentration, and so forth and so on. On top of it, the Russians, when it came to localized ISR, weren't at the same point. This changed the reality and the perception of this reality. And a huge part of it, as I said, comes directly from the fact that Ukrainians either conned or oversold their victories. And I said that already in 2022. I do not think that Ukrainians have gotten the right lesson from how the Russians crumbled. And the truth is that the Ukrainians forgot that they were going out with the same bang that the Russians were going out in 2022. The whole Kharkov offensive was ground to a halt when they started to get opposed by manpower initially, and we have all in our minds the scenes at Makivka, with the war crime that happened there, and a lot of issues when the reporting started to be reversed. In some areas, as you guys might recall, we had this inexorable advance from the Ukrainian side, and at some point, it stopped. And nobody could explain this, and it happened exactly about a month after a large enough contingent of Mobiks that were called Lafi managed Mobiks by the Ukrainians, but by December it was already clear that those Mobiks just completely killed off the Ukrainian offensive there, and both saved a deeper penetration in Lugansk Oblast, but then slowly started to counterattack in select areas in Kharkov, which ended any kind of hope on the Ukrainian side to penetrate deeper in Lugansk area via the bridgehead that they had established over the Oskol. That bridgehead is still there, but it's going the other way. And of course it's slow, and of course there are problems, because as we discovered by 2023, in this war, what matters is not your planning, is not your efficiency, is nothing. It's just how you sustain your advances and how you can exploit them. How many times the Russians were close to getting Ugledar, but there was no follow-up because they couldn't silence the guns, they couldn't silence the drones, they couldn't silence the infantry, and they couldn't stop the infantry from reinforcing small areas. And of course, you had the topography and so on and so forth. So as I said, the biggest problem for both sides right now is numbers. Speed, but mostly numbers. You can go very fast and clear a huge beachhead. That's what happened with the Ukrainians in Klishivka. Then they spent the next 3 months trying to go beyond that, and they never managed. They never managed even to get past the railway station in Klishivka, let alone try and cut off Bahmut from the south. So let's go back to RUSI, because this is when we're going to go a bit more technical, and we're going to start citing dates. So RUSI said fundamentals were fine, but unfortunately they weren't applied. And I said there are a few things that you don't have the equipment, you don't have the man, or you lied, and your whole calculus is just bogus. With the Ukrainians, the calculus was bogus, so neither the men and the equipment were sufficient to achieve the breakthrough they sought, because according to RUSI again, in 7 days they should have had Tokmak. Let us not forget that the whole point of getting Tokmak in several days would have meant to penetrate over 30 kilometers in depth, but also you would have to open in with a front of at least 10 kilometers in order for both sides of your beachhead, your penetration, to be protected from Russian artillery, which back then was still thought to be reaching only 70 kilometers from your line of protection. So basically 34-kilometer range, give or take. But you have to put them halfway in order for you not to get hit by their counter battery and HIMARS and whatever. We had this discussion very early in the Ukrainian counteroffensive last year, where the Ukrainians were showing a couple of guns burned almost every day. Sometimes we learned that they were showing reruns, and the artillery losses that were claiming were, with the reality, were, let's say, completely bullshit, which also explained why the Ukrainians couldn't go that much deeper than about 7 to 8 kilometers to penetrate in the Robotyne, is because the guns couldn't follow up. And of course, the Russians had multiple assets put in place, minefields, helicopters, drones, artillery, rocket artillery. And then we learned by the month of March 2023 that the Russians were now flying with UMPKs in rather daily basis. And this is going to explain some other things later that RUSI just overlooks. But, so, right off the start, RUSI has a completely wrong way of dealing with this, and it's logical. Why? Because they are looking at data from the Ukrainian general staff. And this data is meant to show that, in fact, the Ukrainians had the right idea, had the right planning, but everything went late. Everything wouldn't come in the proper batches, and they couldn't train their troops for it. This, however, is contradicted by the Ukrainian military itself. People who were formed, trained. We had the discussion between Melnik and Sensor.net, which explained the tempo of both training, deployment, refresher, and going to the attack. So basically, the troops were there already within the time frame that we also saw by the leaks from Lord Teixeira, but I'm not going to open that chapter because it's just a meme level incompetence from the Americans, or a willful leak in order for them to expand the war and keep it going. I don't believe that, but the more we advance, the less I can believe that the Americans are so incompetent, or there are two American planners here, incompetence on one side and hyper-competence on the other, which could be also true. But let's go back to the discussion. And the discussion is, why are the Ukrainians, at least the general staff, saying that there were not enough equipment, it came too late, it wasn't the good quantities, it was the good quality, some of them were not actually well adapted to. But to start with, we already had the discussion over the armored equipment. When it comes strictly to the tanks, the Western tanks that were sent there, if we put them together, we would get between 150 and 170, depending who you listen about, Leopards, Abrams. and Challengers. Leopard ones, I will not discuss it because we saw at the first ever contact, one was lost, and then they were never shown again. And to this day, they are mostly used for training, which is an absurdity in my opinion, because nothing in those tanks corresponds to what the Ukrainians might receive later on. So basically in this case, we have a major mismanagement of how the things are going, because you are giving to these guys a tank that has no proper value except, of course, being a barrel on tracks. But on the same time, the Russians are doing the same. They're going into attacks with T-62s and T-54s, 55s. So in a certain sense, that the fact that the Ukrainians are using it shows that the Leopard 1s are even more useless, because it has nothing to do with how they are sparing the lives of their people. They are equipping these tanks with air cages. Some of them have already covered 2 systems, so basically counter-UAS. But overall, as I said, the kind of equipment that was given by the Leopard 1s was already too heavy, was a mismatch in logistics, and the Americans, for instance, literally shut the bed by giving everything without a sustainability program, which meant that the tanks were only employed very late in 2023 and early 2024, and in such a way that it led to losses and general ridicule of the tank, especially when, after getting sorted out in its normal attire, Ukraine started to equip it with Arat era that was usually to be lined up on the hull sides. Then it was turret sides. Then K1 started to appear on the frontal hull. Then now we have cope cages, and we have, of course, some attempts at electronic warfare. The latest one that got clapped by an FPV, if you have seen, has the full kit on it. So basically, air on the hull, air on the turret, and the unfortunate cope cages, which, as I said, does not change much given the ability of FPVs to attack you on a 180 half hemisphere way. So you will have to cover everything, especially your bustle, which is the most fragile part after the engine deck. So generally speaking, the aid that Ukrainians received was not enough. And by not being enough, and this is what I explained beyond the counter started, you can have a superior system, but if it's not deployed in large enough numbers to have an impact, it actually is going to bring down the actual value of your team, of your layout. Basically, if you have only 10, 14 challengers and the rest of it are T-72 clones, if you use your challengers as a spearhead and you lose them, then your whole calculus is changed forever, because then the other tanks are supposed to be less good. By having a lot of trash around your trump card, ace in the sleeve, whatever, you are just reducing the value of this ace in your sleeve to the average value of the trash you get around you. And it was the same thing for the other equipment. Okay, fine, you got maybe, 180 Bradleys and another 100 Marders. It's cool. But the mass of IVs that you have them surrounded with are still BMP-1, BMP-2s. And on top of it, the Bradley and the Marder are not even superior to what you need these vehicles for. The Bradley right now is being used on defensive pillbox style mobile pillbox, and it's fine until it has its shot. Once it's spotted, most of the time it ends up with a track on the side of the road, a lancet, and other shit. And this is the biggest problem that you have. Once your Bradley goes out, your mobile firepower pillbox is gone. And what are you going to do? Are they going to pull it out with a BTS, which means you're going to lose a second vehicle, another Bradley second vehicle, or are you going to use what is in your storage space, which is BMP1s, BMP2s, a completely other vehicle that a lot of people were laughing with because protection is not good. Is that protection on a BMP1 or 2 might not be as good as in the Bradley, but the level of violence that the Ukrainians are exerting on these BMP1 and 2s to stop them and destroy them shows a different doctrine and also availability on the FPV front. We've seen that with Bradleys, with Leopards and so on. When the Russians need to eviscerate one of these guys, FPVs are enough. But for the Bradley side, 1 or 2 and it's out of combat and it cannot be pulled by another vehicle except another Bradley or a higher torque equipment. Which in a certain sense gets us to what we are right now when you have a dozen Bradleys that are behind the Russian line and probably have been captured, and you see all these pictures with the Russian soldiers. The attrition system imposed by this very, very mismatched orbit meant that the forces that you were going to use were supposed to actually break Russian morale. So it's literally what Melnik said on his Censored.net interview. And that interview was, we thought that showing Leopard, showing Bradley, showing whatever, these guys are going to flee. They never fled. Actually, one of the things that surprised no one on the Ziggurat sphere is that these guys were pumped as fuck from 4 good months of, I'd say, preparation for that moment. First of all, one thing that RUSI doesn't cite at all is that it's not true that the Ukrainians had failed to identify the weak zones, had failed to point out the few mistakes in the defensive areas that Russia had built up. And it's also wrong to say they didn't have intelligence on those. They tried a recon in force in March 2023. They tried diverse maneuvers both in March 2023 and May 2023. Remember the cross-border raids? That exactly. The attack from Novodorivka towards Robotine was such a intelligence raid. Unfortunately for the Ukrainians, they would both lose it and they would lose every single guy on that raid and every single equipment. But they would also show the Russians exactly what a lot of people like us saw, including back then Romanov, who said that most of the positions were shit, there weren't enough mines, that you had a lot of issues with the interlocking fire system, and also the general positioning of the trenches. Sorry guys, just another cut. But basically, the intelligence failure is an absolute bullshit because we Okay, the mic starts to do the own bullshit again. I'm sorry, guys. But basically, let's go back to what I said. So it wasn't that much a problem of intelligence or a problem of planning. The main issue, as we will see later on, was that the Ukrainians themselves knew that what they were doing was a kind of guinea pig probe in order for them to achieve some kind of breakthrough on that line and frighten the Russians to overreact. This is maybe the biggest mistake, if it's true. I believe that the attempt after March and after the successive failures of creating a breach in the Russian lines and of creating cohesion and panic, like it happened in 2022, is that the Ukrainians themselves understood it was fucked, but they kept going because calling it off right away would have created two things. First of all, a impression to their allies that, okay, these guys are not ready. They're not going to cut it. If they have now full power but cannot execute their own plan, we have a problem here. And maybe the leadership is not up to it. And in my opinion, this is supported by the bullshit that Delusions said by September, when he said, oh, after 2 months, I was reading this Soviet general's memoir, and like, oh, this is not going to work because we are into a stalemate technologically. So basically, it was just throwing people to get ground. And I'm like, I'm sorry, bro, but this is absolute bullshit, because you sustained on one direction was supposed allegedly to be taken in 24 hours. You sustained 83 days of assaults with any kind of unit, which was from the battalion level, from the day one in this area, in this direction, the 6th of June, to the fucking fire team level, when 8 guys managed to go to the outskirts of Novopokrovsk. And you remember the video with the Russian Shmobik, who literally blindsided them and killed them, including the attempt by the motherfucking Ukrainian to commit yet another perfidy by pretending that it was going to surrender, but they went for a grenade. Anyway, the whole logic here, I'm going to repeat, is that from what RUSI is saying and what the Ukrainians are saying themselves, the contradiction here is fundamental. The Ukrainians maybe had a plan, but the attempt to execute this plan that was probably going to be on the heels of a positive and well-developed reconnaissance force from Novodarivka never came. They got smashed there. Their attempts at the border in first Grey-Voron and then towards Sumy were total failures. And these total failures, I think, and this is my opinion, convinced the Ukrainian leadership to try this counter and try and conserve the equipment once that they would achieve a, I think, a preliminary target of being around Tokmak somehow within 2 weeks. The whole pretense that they would go to Tokmak in 1 week, where you would have this 30-kilometer penetration by the forces that Ukrainians were committing on their frontal assault. Let's recall it. They just put roughly a battalion on a single fucking line in multiple areas and got absolutely obliterated. If this is your strategy from day one, and it's not what the Russians did, which basically they put a whole fucking brigade into Zaporozhye direction. Of course, it didn't land them into Zaporozhye, but it advanced at least 80, 90 kilometers, even 100 kilometers at some point. You're doing it wrong. Especially after you let the Russians build up their whole cluster system of mines, fire points, hold-on lines where the helicopters are going to go up, have a wide angle of 10 to 12 kilometers. You are completely in the open. You're not using your trees because the helicopter can see you on every kind of side, given that you don't control the depth and the width of your fire lanes. The Russians do. So all this shit points to actually the Ukrainians trying something at some point. And for them it was, we're going to get to there, and then we're going to start begging for time or for more weapons. Because we will have to show something. We have to show Tokmak. Maybe we are going to put the HIMARS into Mariupol range and just start unloading on Mariupol. This was also reinforced, also reinforced, in my opinion, by the way that they use their low numbers of storm shadows. The first few attacks of storm shadows had nothing to do with the front in Zaporozhye. They were on fucking Lugansk. It keeps going, and the best part of it is that that attack made sense. Lugansk is a staging point, and it helped, in a certain sense, reduce the ongoing creeping offensive by the Russians from Lugansk to Kharkov. So that made sense. What didn't make sense then is, as it's discussed on the RUSI study, whatever you want to call it, attacking the bridges between Crimea and Kherson. It makes no sense for one huge reason. Most of the bridges, or those bridges, were over 100 kilometers away. And in order to go and exploit that, so basically put a pressure on those points, would have you not go to Tokmak, but be to Mariupol in 7 days. That would have been a panic attack for the Russians. But they never exceeded half a kilometer a week in depth. That never happened. On top of it, the directions chosen for the push, both in Robotine and in the Vremensky Salient, were on low ground. And it's logical. Low ground allows you to go fast. That's where you're usually going to build most of your connections and so on. Because you are going from up to down. The problem is that there is another up after that, especially if it's a valley. At some point your flat ends. At some point your downslope ends. And your visibility gets worse. And it doesn't matter that you have drones. Both sides had drones at that point. Both sides had effective means of destruction beyond 20 to 30 kilometers. And the Russians had the huge advantage of being the receiving party. So they could play with their depth. But the biggest difference is that the planning, which was, once again, I do not believe it because it would be extremely stupid, the planning which was to grab those 20, 30 kilometers and then bring the HIMARS close to start unraveling the Russian logistics on the Melitopol, Tokmak axis, that's a pipe dream. It's a pipe dream because the biggest situation that we had with the HIMARS pinpoint attacks in Kharkov were that the Russians themselves had interlocked into a domino effect. First, they had over-concentrated their means, which was logical because they were still trying to do something with Izium going towards Barvinkova. If they had Barvinkova, they could have crept even down south, and that would have caused a huge problem for the traffic between Kharkov and the Donetsk Oblast. Russia never managed to do that. They never had the seat in Barvinkova. And they overexposed their western flank, and then what happened, happened. On top of it, they completely neglected the losses in Kharkov area, in my opinion, mostly because the Kharkov Oblast for the Russians, a bit like what we saw right now, isn't that important to the kind of war they're having right now. It makes no sense to have Kharkov while you are trying to have Crimea be viable after the war is done with. So the Russians had to shrink their expectations, but the minimum expectations that they had to have was to guarantee this land bridge to Crimea. So what are you going to choose? Are you going to choose a northern oblast, a northeastern oblast, that is supposedly considered pro-Russian, but who also mobilized as fuck against you when you came without actually ravaging the place? Or are you going to start to defend the only thing that makes this war still logical for the Russian side, and on top of it, where you can also expand, because the areas that the Ukrainians chose, which to my opinion were stupid, because they were identified by the Russians, but also would have left them extremely vulnerable if they had advanced a bit deeper, especially after Novopokrovsk, as I said, that opened a complete defilade of Russian positions towards any kind of Ukrainian assault force. And in my opinion, had the Ukrainians broke in and brought the rest of the stock of equipment and weaponry that had received by the West, the loss would have been terminal. Literally, instead of losing 120-something tanks in the area, they would have lost probably the full mounted, between 200 and 220. And there was no coming back from that. There was literally no coming back for that for at least probably next year, because we're seeing the fact that they lost not that many heavy equipment. They can still use them in this fucking differentiated recoiling defense, which in my opinion is completely bullshit. But it allows the Ukrainians to have this fake imago that we're having right now, that they are resisting, that the front is stabilizing. Reality, the front is not stabilizing at all. Sometimes it accelerates, like we had the last couple of weeks, when the Russians in a couple of few days did 20, 30, 20, 27, 30 kilometers, square kilometers of advancement, and sometimes it's lower, 9, 10, with loss of some space, like part of the Serebrenka forest, and also the stalemate in the Kharkov Oblast, although the operation is bearing fruit. So the logic of the Ukrainian defense and offense during the counter completely belies the idea that somehow the Ukrainians had the good ideas, but were not helped by the delays from the Western partners, and were not helped by the fact that a lot of this planning was to go fast enough so not to bear the brunt of the Russian defenders. Because that's what they say at some point. They say, okay, they had to face 105,000 Russian troops in total in the area, with 470 tanks. I'm like, what the fuck? The issue with this idea of Russians having all this equipment at disposal in Zaporozhye, and your whole 12 brigades have less. But if you concentrate them, you have this Panzerfaust, you're going to advance in a certain direction and spread up, open up this huge salient, and then suddenly the rest is going to come. I'm like, what is going to come? The fact that they didn't manage to go through Pokrovsk, and so basically they didn't have the means strategically to go after it, on top of it because they were losing shit in Bakhmut, and also they tried to stop the creeping offensive up in Kupiansk, means exactly what the problem was. You didn't have the means for your strategic posture. So at that point, the question is, how sound was your operation? How sound was your planning? How sound was your whole thinking of this? I mean, I'm going to say as this, like, Living on the Prairie is a great song, but that's not a sound military fucking strategy. And also, this shines another fucking light. If this was your line of thinking, what exactly did you do in Kharkov? Because it's your experience that is put ahead here. In Kharkov, for some reason, it worked. That's what the pro-Ukrainian is going to say. Maybe that reason is that, in fact, the area in Kharkov was complete shit. The Russians completely abandoned that part. And also, the leadership around that area was a bunch of fuckers who said, okay, you know what, nothing's going to ever happen because we have the initiative all over the front. So it doesn't matter if they have a small advance here and there. We are seeing a bit of that in the Serebrenka forest. And that's why it's tingling me. They have no good options on passing there, the Ukrainians, because they are going to go into marshland and to bottlenecks. But, you know, better said than sorry, I'd say. And this is why I think the Russians are pushing from Rozdolivka and south of Siversk in order for the Ukrainians not to be able to exploit the advances if they start losing the southern positions and Siversk gets threatened from the south. But let's rethink the whole fucking process. So, the operational context, as described by RUSI, it's junk shit. It's absolutely junk shit because RUSI is saying that the Russians had a limited artillery support in Kherson in 2022, and they used it effectively. And like, if they used it effectively, why the fact? Then why the fuck would you start telling everybody that you liberated Kherson or Kharkov in that sense under extreme Russian duress when you start by saying that the Russians have already limited means to defend themselves in Kherson and you still had huge issues to go through? So there already, as I described initially, you start to understand that even RUSI cannot hide that problem. The fact that, in reality, Kherson, whether it succeeded or not, it wasn't that much because of direct Ukrainian pressure. It was due to the fact that the Russians made the calculus that the Ukrainians didn't make, which is, and we know this already, because I described it, that either you fight to retain Kherson city and you lose the Kherson Oblast, because you're going to have a bunch of guys that are going to get trapped on the other bank when inevitably it's going to fall. And it would have taken 6 months or 9 months, but at the end of the day, it was too easy for the Ukrainians to attack their bottlenecks than it was for the Russians to have new passages. And on the other side, as I said, once you fucking are on the other bank, and it's true, okay, you're gonna lose 20-23% of Kherson Oblast, but you have all the rest, and the most important part, you have a fucking unsurpassable line, and we saw that with Krinky. In order to have a beachhead on the other side, survive and expand it, you cannot do it without Ukraine is throwing to the Russians right now. Never mind how many FPVs, artillery, or whatever is being used. So, we keep going with the operational prospect, and then the main outlines for major offensive were in place by September 2022, and the successes for Kherson and Kharkiv offensive. The problem is that in Kherson and Kharkiv, by September 2022, you don't have any kind of surprise or any kind of win. What you have by then is true. The Russians are kicked out of a large part of their holdings in Kharkiv Oblast, but Kherson is not done. The real backbreaker for Kherson would happen in October when the northeastern Kherson line for the Russians will completely break down under the unrelented assaults of the Ukrainians, something that, by the way, should have learned the Ukrainians what was going to happen if they wanted to have things in Zaporozhye. They would have to go for 3, even 4 months before something would happen in terms of operational success. And suddenly, they ignore this and they apparently make up a plan based on half a fluke and an outlier, which was Kharkov, and ignoring the lessons of what was happening in Kherson. If this is what the Ukrainian general staff was doing, that's a huge own goal. However, the problem that goes on is that they started to mingle Bahmut to the whole process of how are they going to plan for a counter in Zaporozhye. And they start by saying, okay, Bahmut presented a very good option for protracted defense because that would have meant Russian losses. I'm like, it's fine, man. I get it. But if you know this, if you know that you're going to play defense, wouldn't you integrate the lessons of your own defense on how you're going to tackle a similarly designed, drawn-up defense with extra fucking spicy assets like helicopters, like Lancets, like aviation? Because this is also another problem that we're seeing. Let's say for a moment that we believe that 20,000 Wagner Zeks are dead, assaulting Bahmut for 10 to 12 months. Aren't you understanding what it would take from you to just get that much ground, which is 36 kilometers of depth, one major city, and a secondary city like Soledar? How in the world, while you are thinking this, while you are seeing what the Russians are doing, and with the quote-unquote the advantages that they have, how the fuck are you going at it by thinking that with allegedly, once again, 1/4 of the forces that the Russians are committing for the whole fucking front, you're going to succeed when they are failed? And there's where I said to you guys that back in May 2023, this is a hubris problem. You start to believe your own lies. You start to think that you're superior to the Russians for reasons that have nothing to do with the reality. You start to believe in your own fucking mythology. And I think the best example for this is what's going on between Hamas and Israel. An overwhelming advantage on the Israeli side is resulting in extreme wear and tear of their equipment and capabilities. They are running out of available tanks. I'm not saying that all those tanks are destroyed, it's just availability, which means that they fought with them for 6-7 months. Part of them are destroyed, part of them are damaged, need repairs, and the other part needs maintenance, fundamental maintenance, because whereas they have driven too hard, whereas they have accumulated fatigue on equipment or on parts, whereas it's also the crews that are fucking exhausted. You arrive to a point when a local behemoth like Israel needs more tanks. He's starting to pilfer the 155mm market under the nose of Ukraine. This is all the things that I'm pointing out that the Ukrainians were laying out this kind of mythology that when you see another conflict that is happening at the same time with the expenditure, with the advantages that one side has over the other, you understand that it wasn't possible. So, yes, maybe the Russians could have fucked up again and run away. Or maybe they wouldn't, because they knew exactly what you were going to throw at them. Leaks is one side, approach is another. Also the real losses, because another thing that we don't see on the report itself is what are the real losses. It's true that they speak about 30,000 killed or missing in action, but how much did you actually have at wounded, irrecoverables, and one potential answer to that was given more or less at the start of the end of the counter, when we learned that up to 50,000 prostheses for amputees were in demand based on data and requests by the Ukrainian government. If you added again another company, Ukrainian one, as opposed to the German-American one, Otterbook, when you added the 7,000 that the Ukrainian company had already produced by the second half of 2022, you see that, in fact, the problem of losses was staggering. We have already discussed about the fourth generation from the Allies, which was roughly 63,000, as described by the Americans. But we also learned that the ongoing training wasn't meant to accumulate this force. We had French articles just before the offensive saying, like, guys we trained in October, 40-60% are dead or gone. And you're like, okay, if you have lost 40-60% in 6 months, and the training effort started in October, and it's the same for all the training equipped partners, that means that if we say 60,000 were trained by NATO and you're in April, that means that out of the 40,000 something, you have lost half of it, so 20,000 people are gone. So the whole force that is remaining that you have trained, allegedly for these NATO brigades, is how much? 30,000? Given that you have the 20,000 remaining plus the 2 extra months until June of training, that because in June it was described that there were 60,000 ready to go. So what is this? How are you going again with 30,000? Are you going to do anything in a front that you yourself said 50,000 Czechs were killed, or even 20,000? And you're going to say, oh yeah, but the Russians don't respect their own. Those guys were just, meat to be thrown over there. And it's fine. Let's say that Russians did that. But after the first few actions in Zaporozhye, we also knew that you were just meat-waving your shit in with some shit boxes around it. Everybody has in mind the Minesweeper video, but it's not only that. Remember that we were laughing so hard the first 3 days in Zaporozhye, because every single day it was a fucking shit show. Every single day we had 10, 12 strikes from K-52s. We had Bobber also posting 10 strikes. Then we had BDA footage. Sometimes it was just a small, like a teaser. And then we had the whole fucking footage. It was a fucking carnage of Western armor and Eastern armor alike. So what exactly are we discussing here? How the Ukrainians could have thought that with these 40,000, these 12 brigades, they were going to be able, first of all, to concentrate, and this was the point that we discussed before it even happened. If you're not able to concentrate because the network that you have around you, be that the urban network and the road network, just cannot have you put 20,000 guys and like 200 tanks up front without getting Iskandered, without getting bombed, without having the whole fucking Russian helicopter lineup with Vika and whatnot, nuking the bejesus out of you. And the same is true for the Russians who tried that shit in Avdiivka. And the first push worked only because they amassed like a megaton of armor and managed to go way beyond the Terikon. They had the high ground, they grabbed some positions, and they fucking stuck there and started to put the people to just hold them. And that's the fucking problem. So everything that is being described so far by RUSI, every kind of basis for trying to call the operation sound based on the past efforts on both sides, and especially on Russian failures or successes, leads everyone to think, dude, what you're saying is not possible because you are having less troops, less tanks, no air cover, no air defense. Your only fucking trump card, and we spoke about it, is turning the HIMARS from a tactical force multiplier into an actual counter-battery asset, which means you're going to fire more, and what you're going to start taking out is not ammo dumps, is not a large concentration of equipment. No, you're going to start taking 1, 2, maybe 3 guns at once. 1, 2, maybe, what was the maximum? 4 grad multiple rocket launchers. That's a lot. I'm not saying it's not a lot. But the only thing you're doing, you're spreading these fires. At some point, they were hitting D-20s, for fuck's sake. Single D-20s with 1 or 2 HIMARS strikes. Like, what the fuck? HIMARS was used to choke the Russians in Kherson. And now suddenly what you're doing is hitting single BTRs. For what? Also, one of the biggest problems for the Ukrainians is having all the HIMARS as a trump card and the aviation being basically absent meant that the Russian aviation, the Russian domination on select proportion of the sky was huge. We all remember how fucking much they seethed over the fact that the Ka-52s were literally shitting on them day and night for almost 2 months and a half before finally they shot one down. And it required a fucking ad hoc operation to get one with an RBS-70. And it was way too late to make any difference. And when they got the Atacams, and remember they attacked Berdyansk airfield, it was too late. It was in fucking October. The Russians had already started their counteroffensive. So, the problem here is obvious that, once again, whatever is discussed is that the fundamentals weren't right at all. The fundamentals relied on a lie or on Zaluzhny literally blowing multiple substances and going ham on whatever he thought he saw in Kharkov. Literally, because that's exactly what most of the guys are saying from the front. We thought the Russians were going to go away. They're going to run. So what's the point here? Why RUSI needs to keep lying like this? I don't understand. We're going to learn why. So, first of all, they're laying out the axis. And the first axis they say is Bahmut. And I said, honestly, I want to commend seriously for doing what they did on Bahmut, because that allowed the Russians not to get too close to Chasiv Yar too quickly. And where a lot of people are saying that they don't understand why Bahmut was prioritized to a certain point, well, it's very simple. It's to not allow what happened right now, last few months, where the Russians advanced towards Bahmut and now are literally at the canal and are probably going to cross in the upcoming days or weeks. Had the Bahmut direction just, I'd say, been abandoned by February 2023, and the Russians just led to roam a bit further, basically arriving into this depth, this small valley between Bahmut and Chasiv Yar, then they would have had a head start for the rest of the operation that we're seeing now. The Russians really took over the Bahmut direction once Avdiivka played out. So basically, by February 2024, when it was obvious that Avdiivka was done, the Russians gave a little bit of an umph on the Bahmut direction, and we ended up with the current layout. But imagine if in February 2023, instead of February 2024, the Russians were already where they are right now. The threat towards Konstantinovka would have been way higher, and therefore, on that aspect alone, Syrskyi merits commendation, because he understood, not that it was that hard to understand, but he understood exactly where the Russians were going to go. Now, the second direction, they say they had the first direction that had the greatest freedom of maneuver. We saw that that's not true. The penetration from the western outmost positions from the Russians towards Bahmut was about 8 kilometers as well, if you're stretching. So, once again, RUSI cannot stop making shit up, but okay, whatever, doesn't matter. Then the other direction was to attack Crimea, so basically blow up multiple bridges. This doesn't need an explanation, especially since they did that. They severed direct connection in October 2022, where a lot of people celebrated after the Ukrainian terrorist attack on both bridges by this huge-ass truck bomb. But because of this land bridge, as I said to you guys, this land bridge connection, the effect on that aspect was extremely limited, and nothing really happened. Let's say it like this. So the biggest situation with the second quote-unquote direction is that it's just bullshit. Then we have the third direction, fourth direction, so on. But basically, we are going to stop to the quote-unquote direction of Tokmak, Melitopol, and so on. The funny part with the said direction towards Tokmak is that it was also the most fortified, and therefore what I described until now, so the fact that the experience that I had with the Kherson lines and later on with the reinforced Kharkov lines should have told them a lesson. Apparently, it had also to do with the fact that it was also chosen due to a lack of other solutions for the area. And on that aspect, I understand perfectly that they cannot say exactly why, but they can say why not in a certain sense. So you have the Ukrainians choosing for Tokmak and so on, but they're choosing that because basically there is nothing else to do. Like, on a certain sense, you have Bahmut, but the problem with Bahmut is it's a lot more a preventative maneuver than it's an exploitation maneuver. Because that's the thing, you're gonna have your fight in Bahmut, and instead of going around Bahmut, cutting it, encircling it, and making the Russians side pull out, you're gonna have to go back into urban combat, and that's exactly where the Ukrainians didn't want to go, given how the Russians had started to employ UMPKs. And we have this very great discussion recently from Konrad Muzyka. We'll speak about it a bit later, when he says a year ago Russians would send hundreds of bombs, none would hit the target. This year they sent four of them hit the target. This, of course, is bullshit, but it shows exactly what would have changed for the Ukrainians if they had attempted to invest Bakhmut after the fight on the approaches and so forth. All this, once again, is, in my opinion, bad cope, but it's also logical because it comes from their flawed source, which is the Ukrainian General Staff. Once again, we are discussing the forces on the Zaporozhye axis, and as I said, when you read it, there are like 470 tanks, 720 artillery systems, 230 millets, so on. And when you see these amounts and you compare them with what the Ukrainians were to receive, because we have the leaks from, once again, Dog Shaker, you see that in base case scenario, it's 2/3 of what allegedly the Ukrainians were going to receive. 2/3, and that's tanks. So you can head to Nalsio, who shits the bed every single week with Russian losses because he forgets a couple of Ukrainian losses, but it's not a big issue, even if you use it right now. You head on to the Zaporozhye front losses, you're going to see that on artillery pieces alone, the Ukrainians got never close to what they were claiming daily. Tanks, just the same. If these are the tanks available to the Russians on the area, if you stop in October 2023 at Nalsio, you're going to see that it's a fucking disaster. It's an absolute disaster because they're having the capability to inflict losses when the Russians are counterattacking to, block them from advancing, but it's nowhere near what they need in order to grind the Russians down. To the contrary, when you see how much IVs they're losing, how much mobility assets they're losing compared to the Russians, you understand what the problem was. The problem was that every time the Ukrainians would go on the assault on a mechanized force, they would lose, as I said, between 60 and 80% of that force. Most of the times it would be even 100, like the attacks on Urozhanye, when they go in with 4 MRAPs and they go out without MRAPs. Nobody goes out, actually. And you have 24 plus KIA on that day. These are losses that accumulate, and not only accumulate, but also grind your morale, not the Russian ones. Every time the Russians would see a fucking Leopard blow, it would be a plus 10,000 on morale. And it wouldn't matter. We have videos from the guys who, a lot of them are not among us for that, but these guys were smiling on defense. Compare that with the way how Ukrainians are on defense. They are fucking shitting their pants. They are sad. They are absolutely disgusted, and they are turning into a bunch of little shitty savages that actually they are. The hatred hits both sides in a completely different manner when they are on defense. There is a sense of hopelessness that the Russians had during the late summer and fall and winter 2022, early 2023. And then you have the Ukrainians right now, where they are in defense, their fucking whole life seems to have ended. For all the bullshit they say about the Russians, that the Russians are zombies, just fucking listen to them. And so it goes. So the Ukrainian offensive, according to RUSI, mid-May, initiated operations Bakhmut axis intended to fix Russian forces ahead of the main effort in the south. I do not think that fixing is a good idea. I do really think that the whole point was to try and dislodge the Russians, who were basically reaching their boiling point in terms of manpower in Bakhmut. This due mostly to the fact that Pigorjid had decided that he would do cavalier seul, and instead of having this, reinforced strength on the basically whole front, and have a renewed capability to have all these people discuss with the Russian Minister of Defense on how he was going to further prosecute the war with ZEX. Simply the Russian military had enough of this bullshit, and also in a certain sense had this feeling that we also had at some point in April 2023, when the shit show about ammunition started, that in fact Pigorjid wasn't interested anymore on waging this war. What he was losing is mostly men that he could have used to make money in Africa. What he was losing was also his, in my opinion, freedom to do whatever he wanted with the money or with the resources. More and more the Russians were, Russian Ministry of Defense was asking for accountability based on the successes, because at some point Wagner themselves, they ground the fucking advance to a halt. From March to April, the situation was untenable for the Ukrainians. Then the April shenanigans started, and suddenly Wagner was gaining less ground that the Russians were starting to get up north on the Luhansk axis. So the logic was, but now, what the fuck is going on? Are we going to go on or not? And what I think Syrski got, I'm not going to start speaking about Pigorjid being compromised, because I think that's bullshit. I think this guy just wanted to go solo, and that's it. But Syrski understood that the lack of advances in Bakhmut from Wagner was basically the Russians abandoning the initiative in the area. So he seized the potentially extremely well done chance to maybe recover part of the city, and also force the Russians to divest a lot more troops in Bakhmut than they did. Instead of doing that, the Russians literally let the Ukrainians advance rather deep in Bakhmut for a month and a half, until Pigorjid started his mutiny. the crumple zones in front of Bahmut that the Russians had acquired by other units than the ones of Wagner, that, as was discussed, were always being villainized by Wagner, but at the end, the understanding was that Wagner wasn't some kind of miracle. They were as much a flawed force and manpower-consuming force as the rest of the Russian army. The difference is their PR was on point, let's say it as it is. So, it's not a fixing operation. Sierski attempted to do a quick redraw of the map there in order for him to allow the Russians to panic a little bit there, and a lot of people had that. I had a discussion with that Japanese lady that was supposedly pro-Russian that would tell everybody, oh, the flanks are going to crumble, the flanks are going to crumble. We are over a year after the discussion, which started roughly the 27th of May, 2023, and where are the fucking flanks right now? The truth is that the Klishivka area is still largely a gray zone. Russians got most of Klishivka and the Ukrainians are out of it, but the backfield behind it has not been retaken. What has been retaken, though, is interesting areas that go towards Strasov Yar. So on that aspect, once again, as I said, Sierski didn't try to fix them. Sierski really saw a weakness in the Russian system and tried to profit from it. Unfortunately for Sierski, is that he didn't get the troops he wanted, but also, I think Zaluzhny himself understood that we're going to continue to Bahmut again, recover it. It's going to be a huge morale booster, but we're going to get burned into the bombs. And he knew that because the bombs had already started falling over Orikhiv and the Zaporozhye area. And we can see from the multiple videos from basically mid-June to end of July, we had the CNN interview of Ukrainian troops, and they said in Orikhiv we were bombed 5 times out of our field hospital, and the last one that was still there was put on the cellar of a huge building in order for it not to be destroyed. So the biggest problem that we have here is that RUSI is firmly trying, in my opinion, to fit the narrative laid out by Zaluzhny. And in a certain sense, it's logical because these guys and a lot of other people literally trumped up that guy to become the Iron General, all this bullshit. But once we see the problem with we can understand a couple of things. First of them is that Bahmut had also losses initially, but nobody wanted Bahmut on the general staff to succeed, in my opinion. So this aspect of intestine fighting between Zaluzhny and Sierski might be one of the things that we are not looking through. Because if Bahmut has losses, but frees ground up, but Zaporozhye has arguably the same kind of losses, but fails, while also being your game plan, because don't forget, it's like Zapo is your, your whole fucking game here. Bahmut is, as I said, in my opinion, it's not as much to fix than it is to try and not allow the Russians to actually start getting comfy on that ground. In a certain sense, that's what happened with Avdiivka in February. The moment the Russians started to get hold of the city, the Ukrainians literally started to use freshly delivered GBUs and HIMARS ground-launched small diameter bombs to make it impossible for them to use the large industrial areas that the city had to offer for the Russians in order to make Avdiivka a staging point. Only it was done by actual physical power, trying to dislodge the Russians and not let them, fortify their positions. But this is not what RUSI says. For RUSI, it's like they want to fix the Russians there. For what? At the end of the day, as I said, even if the Russians get to Chasov, back then, if your operation is a planning success, you're going to be in Tokmak in 7 days. And the threat of cutting the Crimean land bridge is way bigger than maybe having the Ukrainians duke it out into the streets of Bakhmut again. Especially as the Russians right away started to point out the problems with Wagner. You remember what happened when all this bullshit with Biber and Dolik happened? Pigorojit pointed them out as, I'm going to let my best fighters because they are better than 72nd. This is it. The whole fucking shtick of Pigorojit was the same PR the Ukrainians had. And in a certain sense, a lot of people had this appeal from him because in a certain sense he was replying to the Ukrainian PR. Instead of having this dry, bullshitish PR shit show that the Russian Ministry of Defense still has up to this day. And then we have this discussion that they're describing tactics on how the Russians would fend off the Ukrainians. Reality is even simpler. Even if the Russians didn't have the FPVs, because when you compare how Bobr was using the FPVs against how the Ukrainians are using them now in defense, it's night and day. It's true that Bobr was literally shitting on the Ukrainian advancing forces with the FPVs. But I would tell you that the maximum that the Bobr troops grinded out on that direction in a single day was about 12 different vehicles. I think it was maybe 20 FPVs. Ukrainians used 20 FPVs for now a group of Russian dismounts. So even if the FPV isn't in the game, the Ukrainians had a huge problem with Russian artillery, Russian minefields, and also on how they were trying to clear Russian redoubts, Russian trenches, and so on. Once the big, huge-ass mechanized pushes had failed, they were doing the exact same thing that everybody mocked the Russians for over a year and a half. Couple of IVs, maybe 20 guys, you send them over. If they can get close enough, it's fine. Then they're going to start cleaning it up. If they fail, they get spotted, and you got ATGMs firing at them, tanks firing at them, Landsets, mortars, whatever you want, drop bombs, they still end up short. So the FPV game, which is posture-related, let's be honest with it, didn't actually change the Russian outcome in Zaporozhye. The tactics and the tactical outlay from the Russian point of view, with or without the FPV, wasn't such a big problem. They knew what they wanted to do, they knew where they wanted to do it, and how. And then they recognized something, but that I always said. Beginning of the offensive, the HIMARS strikes were supposedly attacking C2s of Russian commands. I would say that's a big bullshit, because where it's true that a couple of field commands were targeted, there weren't enough of them targeted to make a difference in the front sectors. Basically, if you're gonna fucking kill the commander of a battalion that is holding the area, that's fucking fine. That's the headquarters, and okay, no problem. But those guys are not your operational linchpins. The operational linchpins is the guys who have given the tasks in defense. Basically, if you kill the final boss, if you want, it doesn't take out the minions that it has. In this case, in defense, people knew what to do because it's the most basic bullshit. It's literally Moscow sees kill, Moscow kills to kill. On top of it, a huge part of the defensive perimeter was passive. So it's all good and fine that you kill the colonel 50 kilometers from line, but it doesn't solve your problem with the mines. Neither does it solve the problems with the motherfucking Zeks who have been on the assault for 6 to 8 months, and finally they are transferred into Zapo and see you can see the fucking white of your eyes before slaughtering you. This is the problem. And of course they discussed the whole point of reprioritizing the Gemiras. It came too late. I don't think it came too late because the strikes, for instance, in Blagodatne, in the Verminsky salient, were the very first day. It even allowed, by losing a whole battery of Mussa-raseh, to the Ukrainians to advance in the heart of the first crumple zone on that area and take Neskuchne, Blagodatne, and then the advancement up to the first problem around Staromayorsk and then Rozhany, which both took like between 2 and 4 weeks to take for very, very small positions. And we will not speak about Robotina, which took 83 days to take. So, RUSI once again understands what happened, understands a lot of things that we discussed in real time and even before, but they cannot shake the need to somehow try and justify why the things were done. And I'm like, it makes it even look worse because suddenly you start with C2, but instead of keep going with the C2, you halfway stop with the C2 and try to go for frontline units and use them as a tactical firing asset. It reeks of the contrary to what we said. If your plan is sound, if your plan is sound, you have a huge problem. You have a very huge problem when you are diverting your only trump card to from basically a depth threat to a frontline facilitator. It doesn't work like that. Back in 2022, they would use the Kritnik, they would use Excalibur, they would use artillery barrages, they would use dump assets as well. And that would save the HIMARS for deeper strikes. But suddenly you recognizing that the assets that you have on the front line are not enough, are not able to contend with the Russians, shows that your planning is wrong. It's right there. So what's the point? Why the 40 something pages if you're going to start burning the lead halfway through? But it gets more interesting a bit later on. Assessing the causes of failure, and you're like, for the Russians, the Problem in 2022 was not enough troops for too much ground, and also that meant problems that usually will have. So perimeter detail wasn't there, so nobody was there to accompany logistical trails, or not enough, so ambushes would happen. They would be too close, they would be too obvious, and they would go through the very limited Ukrainian road network, which, as I said, mostly true. But adapting and learning, how? The Russians' adaptation, maximum adaptation, is literally getting rid of a politically charged front, which is north. Kiev, Sumy, Chernigov. I still contend that Chernigov was military feasible, especially with the flank being shouldered by Belarus, but whatever, I don't give a fuck. Right now it's done, it's done. But reducing the front line from the Russians' perspective and from the Russian Ministry of Defense perspective apparently was the goal since the get-go. Reading what has been said by confidants when it comes to Putin, the fact that he wanted the shittiest deal possible for as long as he would stop the war and try to get him back out of the sanction space and all this bullshit, shows exactly what the problem is here. The military made him stop this bullshit, because I think that they had a different plan in view, a different idea, which was literally put everything south in Donbass, rush, sorry to make a bad joke, rush B, and it's done. And suddenly you have to go behind the Ukrainian forces in Donbass with a lot more equipment, and you have a lot more depth from there than, for instance, Milerovo or the air bases toward Sumy, and from the north, cutting through Belarus. The whole idea, when you start this war in February 2022, and you see how fast the Russians went from Crimea towards the south of Ukraine, clearly is a no-brainer. The Russians had a very good logical plan for the south. They had a lot of mishaps and a lot of problems, in my opinion, due to the fact that the political design was to somehow threaten the Ukrainian sovereignty and threaten the Ukrainian political process, the Ukrainian politics. So basically deposing Zelensky. The problem with that idea is that you don't have the manpower to seize Kiev. In the biggest and baddest and most unsupported variants of the Russian plan, now everybody say 80% of the forces were up north. But that includes from Kharkov to fucking Kiev. So if you have to divide this in four main fronts, it's still the same. You're going to have 60,000 people for Kiev. It's a city of 3.5 million inhabitants that you're going to seize with 60,000 people. It makes no sense. It makes absolutely no sense. So the whole idea that somehow the Russians were these stupid guys who never learned anything, and that the main difference between the two troops was just purely a kind of redemption arc on the military arc on the Russian side is bullshit, because the first thing that happened is Ugledar. Ugledar was once again a shitty operation that was planned to force the Ukrainians out of the city, and it half-assed itself up until to a certain point, then it backfired, because all the things that we have now in the Russian arsenal weren't there. And Ugledar is being described as this attempt of just stalling the Ukrainian preparations by forcing them to have troops in there. But when you see how Ugledar turned out, how it was prepared, and how everything was done, it's clear absolutely that there is nothing in Ugledar that was different than the first times or the multiple other attempts that happened all over 2022. The losses were a bit worse for multiple reasons, especially the fact that they were going uphill. But at the end of the day, there was no threat for the Ukrainian supply lines in Ugledar. So they could have sustained the attrition even longer than they had. The problem with this description of the Russians as being idiots and suddenly being geniuses is, once again, it goes from extreme to the other. Because suddenly that would mean that Ukrainians were geniuses in 2022, but they became idiots in 2023. This is just not possible. Then we got this fucking appeal on history, on the fact that Russians are slow starters. And it might well be true, but the problem in 2023 compared to 2022 has nothing to do with having a slow start. It has, in my opinion, to do with the fact that the Russian military, for bad or worse, got back its war. They were given back their war. The political leadership stopped being idiots and trying to decide everything. And they did a lot of damage. The grain corridor, for instance, allowed the Ukrainians to start planning on, okay, now we're going to have to, export, and we're going to have money. And the grain corridor was not used only for grain or products of that kind. The grain corridor most probably was used for something completely different, which is general exportation. General export meant that steel, alloys, everything that could be exported was being sent. And this means only two things. This means that, first of all, you can start planning a budget. Ukrainians can also think that things are going to change. That people also, and this is where Snake is right in certain sense, Ukrainians are starting to think that a new sense of normalcy can start to take root. And with the new sense of normalcy starting to take root, you're going to have a huge problem, because the previous planning that was mostly shit on the Russian side is now completely different. Initially, you had this idea that you were mostly dealing with, a 60 billion budget. Now the budget is 83 billion. Of course, more than half of it doesn't exist. It needs to be grants and offerings from the allies. But they have 20 extra billion now, be that by donations, be that by orders, be that by whatever. Opening all these initiatives, opening all these advances for Ukraine by letting the political decision-making process overstep on the military one means that you're going to have the worst of both worlds. On one side, you're going to start having losses because the political decision-making will ask from you, and we had this joke about Zelensky asking people to attack Ingolovka, and the military telling him, bro, we don't have anything, we're broke, what the fuck do you want us to do? And they still tried it. They still fucking sent 3-4 BTRs to get smashed over there. But imagine the Russians going for this completely nonsensical attempts in 2023 by trying to push back the Ukrainians on the Kherson axis, and then after that in the Kharkov axis, trying to retake Makivka back then with Mobiks and stuff like that. They would have made sense if the Ukrainians wouldn't have already stabilized the front after basically losing initiative in December 2022. But once again, the point is that it's not as much as the Russians were slow or the political decision-making process was taking too much space. It has also to do to the fact that the Russians have this motto that you go to war with the army you have. And that army, for a lot of reasons, wasn't prepared. But this preparation was still overly slow. I mean, look at the way the UNPK numbers have started to stack up now. 2023, over 15,000. 2024, the latest photo of a UNPK, I think it was for June, was over 2018 per kit. So we are already at 16,000 UNPKs, which is more than the whole year of 2023. Plus the new solutions with MPBs and now with a huge monstrosity that's the UNPK 3000. But when you see that, it has nothing to do with the Russians relearning the ropes of it. In most cases, it's just Russians executing what they should have done, what they already had by 2022, be that in project, be that in tests, be that all already existing. I mean, the UNPK module had looked nothing like the one we're having right now. We're having this UNPK module right now because it's firstly cheap, and secondly, it allows the Russians not to change completely the way they are casting their bombs. And also, of course, to put in the best ratio possible their advancement. Same for the Lancet, same for the way they are doing UNPKs. The problem with the Russians is not as much the learning part. The problem with the Russians is that they are, in my opinion, so far extremely highly calculating, and for them, they are not going to try and invent something that they cannot cope with. In a certain sense, as I already said, the Russians are extremely predictable once you understand what they're going to do. And I think that's why Team War Criminal so far has managed to understand what the Russians are going to do. We're not geniuses. I already said this. It's just fucking you see your fundamentals and you're like, okay, what can they do that will not break the bank? You need to see what's around them. But RUSI doesn't look at that at all. RUSI is just checking how much fucking forces there are and how much the Ukrainians should have, thrown at the Russians to get through it. It's not like that. You are, as I said, I already made a whole fucking mess out of it, but you are forgetting all the lessons that you should have taken from the Russians themselves when they got defeated in 2022. So, then you have this discussion that, in fact, the Ukrainians should have had the artillery, and with this artillery, they would have gone as force multipliers and, silence Russian guns, silence Russian positions, and it's fine. Everything's going to be fine. And if that doesn't work, use a game changer like the fucking cluster ammunition. Once again, I already explained that what was happening. The clusters are not going to work if, first of all, you cannot accumulate your fucking guns. And once again, go back to the fucking list Nalcio made. And you're going to see that if the Ukrainians had roughly about 120 barrels for this counteroffensive, of which only part of them were 155 millimeters, look at the fucking losses and you're going to understand that very soon, very, very soon, the Ukrainians were left without barrels to use. And because they were firing a lot of fire missions, with the goal of, silencing Russian guns, which allegedly were over 700. The amortization alone, I'm not even saying the loss from the Russian side, would have already put this whole equation to no. Basically, it was dead on arrival right away. Once again, this was said in 2023. We started in March, we started in April, we started in May. The moment we had definitive numbers from the leaks, it basically certified our analysis. The NATO equipment would maximally equip up to 25 to 26,000 troops, according to what the equipment could carry, how many people you need to operate them, how many people you need to actually supply them at the line, and especially using the mosquito logistics that the Ukrainians were using back then, and are still using right now. So the quality of the Ukrainian offense was one mishap away from disappearing, and this mishap started right off the bat with basically a whole fucking battalion going bust the very first day they tried Zapo. And once it was done in Zapo, everything down there was literally a shit show. So, you saying that at the beginning, at the end, they didn't have a numerical advantage, how is it possible that you say that the fucking planning is sound, but the only thing that you need in offensive operations, which is at least occasional and topographical advantage, basically a localized advantage, at least a localized one, was never there. So what the fuck was sound with this plan if from the beginning you know you don't have enough money to buy your fucking Ferrari? And you don't even have a fucking plan to become a drug dealer or OnlyFans operator. What was the plan? And this is the question that I'm asking to RUSI every single day since 2023. Then they add lack of surprise, inadequate force generation, all this shit I always said. I don't need to fucking go back. We said everybody knew where we were gonna go because you did that in fucking March. Inadequate force generation, of course, because your fucking allies formed these guys, they send them piecemeal to go to places. Those guys got clapped doing bullshit they weren't supposed to do, basically Bahmut, basically North, defending Ugledar, the stupid shit that started to happen already by 2023 around Antonovsky Bridge, around Klinky, around Kozaki Lagery, all these fucking shitty things that Ukrainians did with these quote-unquote retrained troops from the West are most perfectly embodied in the fucking lieutenant colonel that was killed in Novodarivka. They sent this dude with like 9 or 10 M1113s, and dude got grounded. He got killed. All the force was fucked up, and the only thing Ukrainians had of all this shit show was a couple of guys laying suppressive fire on positions that were 400 meters away that they couldn't reach by fucking walking over there. And I think 2 days after this shitty video, and that would actually show where the Ukrainian PR would go for the rest of the war, you had Russians walking past them, picking up M16s and shit, and kicking half decomposed Ukrainian bodies. That is improper force generation, improper planning, and also I had all the description of the engagement. If the Ukrainians would have stood their ground on the counterslope and just started to bombard the position downhill with whatever they had, tanks, mortars, whatever, they would probably even taken the position right away, right there, and put an already serious dent to the defense of Robotine from March 2023. Instead of that, they went down slope, which completely exposed them to the defenders on the counter slope on the other side. This is lack of experience. This is absolute lack of judgment. And that means that these troops that were trained in the fucking UK or God knows where had no idea of the region they were fucking fighting in. Or they made a fucking judgment mistake. But that also shows lack of experience. Especially if you got the fucking LT colonel dropping by to push the troops forward. So once again, and it's true that RUSI goes deficiencies in planning and everything. Once again, the problem is a lot more deeper than all these fucking excuses that are given. Because the emerging challenges that you are trying to identify after that would have to draw from what you learned. And the problem is that you're lying on your losses. How the fuck do you want RUSI to give you a proper BDA if you are still fucking lying to people that only 31,000 guys are dead? I'm not saying that Ukrainians should, give numbers, but then stop lying to these guys, because they are going to fucking think that somehow instead of 30 or 40,000 people, 80,000 are going to do the trick. They're not going to do it. And I'm going to give you this one. Recently it has been said that the Ukrainians are building up new brigades. At least 5 are deployed, and at least 5 others are in formation. And you have to also understand that these brigades are going to go into a front that right now, if you go to deep state and exclude Kharkov, of course, because Kharkov makes no sense as it stands, the front is about 815 kilometers. Which means that on the defensive side alone, you can hold that front with 80,000 troops on the first line, and probably about 60,000 on the second line. So with between 140 and 150,000 troops, you can hold the front as it stands right now. Your problem, though, is that with 150,000 troops, you cannot do anything offensively. Unless it's what we're seeing, which is a fucking hard grind in Serebryanka, couple of attempts that were tried in Kherson that ended in failure, and of course some localized counterattacks that happened around Ugledar once again, but that have ended in tears generally because the Russian pressure, both in troops, material, and expenditure, has been going up tremendously. So, what you need right now, if you want to have these offensive capabilities, let's say that you're going to add not these 10 brigades or 13 brigades or 14 brigades, doesn't matter, because the Ukrainian brigade as it stands right now with the equipment that can be donated, let's say they're going to receive 1,000 extra M113s. That means about 11 to 12,000 people that can be carried over. That means in the current layout of things, the complement for probably, when it comes to purely mechanized troops, for about 10 brigades with the current Ukrainian variant, which is 1,200 troops that can be ferried by these M113s. So just fucking think about it. The number of equipment pieces that you need to go from the 20,000, 30,000 people to the at least 60 to 80,000 that are allegedly needed. We had this discussion that on the brigade combat team, if you want to apply the American forces, you will need at least 5 to serve as your punching fist. That means over 400 over 400 tanks, over 400 Abrams. And that means also over roughly 800 Bradleys at minimum, if not 1,000. That would mean for the Bradleys alone, 20% of what America can actually have in storage, up to 40% of its active fleet. Just ask yourself, why would America do that? I'm not speaking about the Abrams, that's another point, but just for the Bradleys, that would mean a fucking astounding number of equipment to be given, which would need at least a duplicate of the M113s. It will also extend the logistical woes of the Ukrainian army, because right now the Ukrainians are still functioning with at least half of their logisticals being carried over by pickups and civilian trucks. Some people are going to say, oh, but the Russians are doing the same with the Bukhankas. Why not? But it doesn't work. It's not because the Russians are doing something that is quote-unquote bad, that Ukrainians doing the same is good. This is one, the thing I've always said, I say that to NAFO, is laughing that the Russians are losing people while you're losing people at the same intensity is just, schadenfreude. And that's the thing. That's the problem I'm seeing with RUSI. They're not understanding the problem. When they speak about pervasive observation and precision fires, yes, it's super cool that you're going to have FPVs and you're going to have shit flying overhead. But your problem is somewhere else. And that problem is that it's the vectors that need to stop. For the Russians, it's just the same. The problem is to take out the fucking HIMARS or the MiG-29s and Su-27s now, given that they have access to guided bombs. That someone is filming you, that's all good, because the Russians have been doing that for a while right now. It didn't allow them an easier advancement against the Ukrainian defenses. What allowed them that is the vector, so basically Su-34s dropping between 200 plus and 700 plus, now 1,500 plus kilograms of explosives on Ukrainian positions. And also the precision as well. But we are seeing that on both sides the precision's relative. We see supposedly hyper-accurate HIMARS missed from 60 meters and sometimes being bullseye. And we're seeing the Russians having sometimes 3 meters step with their fucking UMPKs, UMPBs, and then sometimes 60 meters. Thank God, on the Russian side, the explosive mass alone makes no difference between 60 meters or 10 meters or straight on target. But for the Ukrainians, that makes a huge difference. The other problem is generally how the Ukrainians can organize themselves not to have a gap in their firing slots. A lot of people have started to claim that Ukrainians now with their dug-ins for this self-propelled artillery are doing something right. I don't believe so, because that reduces the radius of that artillery to go from side to side. Therefore, that it blocks that artillery in a certain slot of area, which means that in order to have another such artillery 20 kilometers away, you're not going to stop and make that artillery move those 20 kilometers. You will have to have another barrel in 20 kilometers and just move it in 2 to 4 kilometers and try to stay silent as much as possible. And in a certain sense, it's what we have learned from a recent article from CNN, when there's a guy that I fire as least as possible, so I'm not important for the Russians. That's the fucking thing. The fucking thing now that Ukrainians are trying to find is redundancy. Having someone else take the brunt of the attack, not you overexposing yourself. And there is the problem with Ukrainians right now. Is the means. And the FPV is covering that problem. It is hiding that problem. But the moment they're going to go on the assault, The FPVs will not be able to do that because the defensive units that the Russians put in place in Zapo last year, they're going to still work. The fundamentals are used by the Ukrainians in defense just the same as the Russians did last year. So it just means what I call the Sisyphus paradigm. So basically, what you inflicted to the Russians in defense right now, the Russians are going to inflict on you in defense themselves, as they already did in 2023. So all these things, like, okay, the electronic battle space management, all this bullshit, it doesn't matter. All this bullshit about the refresh cycles, all this stuff. At the end of the day, your biggest problem on both sides for the last year has been FPVs for the Russians, and they've tried everything from Mad Max electronic warfare to Tsar Mangal, so super cages, and it's still not a solution. On the other side, the Ukrainians are having huge problems with Russian localized ISR and with UMPKs. So what the fuck are you talking about accelerated capability refresh cycles? It makes no sense. The only thing that is happening is literally Ukrainians screaming for the Americans to deliver them, as I already claimed, strategically altering weapons with the caveat that by the time these weapons are going to start showing themselves in the battlefield, the Russians might just accelerate the tempo of escalation, and who the fuck knows what's going to happen. On top of it, don't forget what is happening at the border in Kharkov is something that the Russians had refused to do for so long. But Volchansk was reduced to rubble. That thing is not inhabitable. Even if the Russians pull out of the city, nobody's going to come back there, and the Ukrainian troops in there are going to start hiding like rats. So the logistical hub that Volchansk could have been for both sides is gone. Lipsy might well follow suit if the Russians unleash their madness. The difference in capability that we're seeing is exactly what I was talking for so long. The Ukrainians might ask a lot of things from the Americans, but they're not going to have the quantities necessary to avoid a backlash. And we saw this with the refineries. They just keep going with the refineries, only it's not like it used to be that we had a string of refineries being burnt and a lack of capability on the Russian side. And then Russia replied by simply having their fuel refined elsewhere. Part in Belarus, a part of it is being offset in India. What you're going to do? Are you going to bomb India now in order to stop the Russians? The problem with this war, it's not the small itty-gritty bits. It is the difference in size and difference in capability of both localized industries, economies, political capabilities. On one side, you see the Russians go to Iran, pay 4, 5, 600 million euros, dollars, whatever you want to call it. And on the other side, you got Zelensky crying for money, and for 6 months not having it because some guy in fucking USA wants to stop people from coming through the southern border. This is the difference. One is a proxy. The other guy is its own subject. You don't need to start discussing more unless one has access to actual global markets, even when supposedly he can't, while the other now tries to negotiate a haircut of roughly $9 billion in 3 years, because otherwise they're going to go broke. And that still doesn't solve the budget deficit for Ukraine. This is the biggest problem. This is what RUSI cannot address right now. All the rest of the articles, as I said, is something that we discussed. Last mile logistics being a limiting factor for the troops. All what you're gonna read for the rest of that, and the conclusion is basically the counter was a shit show. It was made a shit show from the get-go because Ukrainians took the wrong lessons from their quote-unquote successes in 2022, and then instead of learning from the ongoing battles and also interpreting properly the Russian successes and defeats in 2002 and 2003, and also understanding the impact of attrition, because that's the thing. A lot of Ado has been said about how attrition helps Ukraine, and RUSI is one of the major promoters of this attrition will save Ukraine. But attrition has a scope. Like, as I said, even if you believe the 20,000 Wagner Zeks that were killed, that scope was basically, I'm sorry to say it like this because those were still human beings, basically killing off undesirables on both sides of the battlefield. So you grab these Zeks and you send them against the Kikils, and in a certain sense it was good luck to both parties for as long as the political leadership in Russia was concerned. Because you are taking out undesirables and at the same time you're killing your enemy. In best case scenario, it works and you've won, and basically Bakhmut is how it happened. And the worst case scenario, you attracted them hard enough that the next wave is going to do the job. And it might seem completely amoral or immoral, depending on your point of view, but the Ukrainians just adopted the same view on this. And in a certain sense, the Ukrainians started first with the bullshit Free Legion of Russia, which is literally putting Russian POWs on the doors and enlisting them into a combat unit, which is mostly illegal. So this aspect is just, once again, as I said, it's not as much all these small details, this analysis that we can do. The reality is just the difference in scope between Russia and Ukraine, the difference in importance in the current global structure between Russia and Ukraine. It is also the difference in the juncture of interest in the world. We have, unfortunately, let's say it as it is, a Western partnership that is going the dollar's way, and it is being challenged by an Asian renewal, be that China, India, whoever. It doesn't really matter. I'm not like being an extreme xenophile, although, as I said, it's on my bio, critical enabler, enjoyer. But the thing is the following. Russia has really the best of luck to be with the Chinese, on board with the Chinese. And it's not about friendship even. It's just about the hard fucking cold calculus. And the Chinese, they're gonna get to the point when everybody's threatening them. It doesn't really matter because, as I said, you can sanction China for its enabling of Russia, but you can sanction China at some point because of their dumping. That's what it happened. So if the Chinese wait to be sanctioned and not help Russia get over the hump, and then help them in order to, have the Europeans and Americans rethink their actions, or helping the Russians right away. The difference is just the time frame in which the Ukrainians are going to feel that direct help towards Russia. And the complementarity between Russia and China, when it comes to the structure, the fact that China is, world's workshop, and the Russians are, let's say, the way Americans said, a fucking gas station with nukes. I mean, it's perfect. It offers the Chinese, and the Chinese, that's the funny thing. Everybody's mocking the power of Siberia, saying, yeah, the Chinese will not need that shit. But, like, a couple of days ago, the joke was that the US and the Indians are going to block the Straits of Malacca, therefore reducing the oil going towards China. And, like, I really posted it. It's 3,300 kilometers worth of solution. You just need to go through Mongolia, which the Mongols are literally dying to have because it's transit fees for them. And the whole Strait of Malacca bullshit is solved. It's solved because the Russians and the Chinese then are going to be fucking linked at the hip. The Russians will not ever need to sell oil to anyone else if the Chinese go into that monogamous power brokering relationship. It's a no-brainer, and the Indians might flip out and get out the BRICS. The problem with the Indians is not that much that they might flip out. They are being both-sided here. The problem with the Indians is that they're going to miss out on that fuel. Right now, the Indians are getting cheap fuel, but then they will have to go back to the market. It's exactly what happened to the Europeans. Everybody said, yeah, but the Russians are not selling at the price they could sell. And I'm like, how? The whole point of Russia swapping its market from east to west is that it keeps its budget price up. Let's recall, budget price in 2022 was $45. Budget price in 2023 rose up to $70, and the average price was $67. So in fact, Russia, despite losing the market, did extremely well due to the fact that the price was calculated at a completely different level. And this year, we're having a twofer, which is Russia still having a high barrel price, but selling even higher than the price cap. So in average, the problem for the Indians is they're going to start paying market price for oil instead of the discounted one. This doesn't mean that the Indians are going to go broke over it, but they're going to have to be balancing the quantities they take with the money they pay. So basically, the consumption from the Indians, due to a certain price, will be lower than what they can achieve right now with the Russian discounts. And that's how the market works. They're going to start losing. They're going to start losing purchase power, so they're going to buy less. Prices are going to start rising in India itself. And the thought of this Indian renewal will just go the same way that the Germans are going right now with the high energy prices that are impacting the industry. So in a certain sense, I keep saying I would really discourage the Indians of going more astray than they've already been, but it's okay. I mean, like, unfortunately, the Indians, when it comes to money, they are as industrious as any other people. But generally, what we're understanding here is, as I said, you got Russia, which is a political and a principal behemoth, and on the other side, you got Ukraine, which is literally a proxy. And this proxy has needs. And these needs range from its military needs to its social and economical needs. And so far, we are going to this step where up to 2023, there was this illusion that Ukraine could have freed most of its territories by itself, and the rest it would have put Russia in such a situation, basically cut the Crimean land bridge, and then the Russians would have been forced to relinquish Crimea and go home their tail between the legs. The problem is that that didn't actually materialize, and instead we have this very slow, painful advance on the Russian side, but it's going the exact right places when it was supposed to go, in my opinion, post-Bakhmut evacuation. And on the other side, the Western response to this is strategic escalation. It's not battlefield escalation. What the West is doing towards Ukraine right now is raising the risk for Ukraine to definitely lose this war. When the West gives F-16s, when the West is going to start talking about, I say, FLAMs or longer range fires, so that the Ukrainians can fire within Ukraine, within Russia, sorry. The danger is that instead of, as I said, not the danger, we had the example with the Russians almost every time that threat has escalated, is that the Russians are going to fucking kill you more, and the terms of surrender or negotiations, let's call it like this, that they're going to propose to you are going to be worse. We started in 2022 with a very meek close, like, oh my God, please just recognize Crimea. We're going to have a special status for Donbass, and it's fine. Then Putin went even further. That there was this madness of trying to, sanctify Crimea, but all the rest could go. And then fast forward 2023, Russians had already annexed the oblast. So basically, legally, for the Russians, it was going to be very complicated to recognize anything else but the abandonment of this oblast. And in 2024, we have Putin coming by saying, you know what? We are going to negotiate, sure, but the basis is you fuckers get the fuck out from the 4 oblasts that are now Russians. Crimea is ours. You don't get into NATO. Your fucking army should be reduced. Everything else you can do whatever. I don't give a fuck. This is a way worse deal than what he wanted to sign in 2022. You have to understand that this deal is not offered because Russia is scared of losing. This deal is offered because Russia wants to end it here. Of course there is the war fatigue, but the problem with this, Russia wouldn't give you this as a fucking minimum line if they weren't ready to go at the maximum line. And the maximum line was betrayed by Zelensky himself when he said, oh, the people are, the latest interview with BBC, when he said, oh, the people are very important, but we are not going to sacrifice 30% of the land just because we're losing people. I'm like, wait a moment, when you put everything together, so the 5 oblasts, if you include the actual Autonomous Republic of Crimea, as it was under the Ukrainian constitution, you are at roughly 24-25%. So how exactly are you going to 30? And then when you check the fucking map, what makes it straight up 30% is if they lose Dnipropetrovsk, the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, at the fucking Dnieper River. And this is one of the things I always said, Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, even if it's mangled by the Dnieper River, is a no-brainer for the Russians. Because it offers such a deep penetration. It is defensible in its width. It makes a salient with the Kharkov Oblast as the map is right now. And if they go to the limits of the Donetsk Oblast, there is a huge chunk of Kharkov Oblast that's literally under threat to be overrun by the Russians. So basically, the next step, if things do not simmer down and a conclusion is not found, I think, within this year as a negotiable issue, is going to be that Dnipropetrovsk Oblast is going to be next. And it will not matter how many Russians are going to die for that shit. It doesn't mean that Russian lives are infinite and they don't care about it. No, it means that if that's the target, it's going to work against the Ukrainian army in this sense. For multiple reasons. First of all, it's tactical because the road network becomes a lot more problematic when you pass from Zapo towards Dnipropetrovsk. The main corridors are over 70 kilometers in between them, whereas they are at 40, 45 kilometers right now. Plus, as I said, if you lose Pokrovsk, which is at the corner of the Donetsk Oblast, your biggest trouble is that now you're going to have people coming for Zaporozhye and people coming from east to west for a chunk of Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, probably until the Samara River and Samara marshes. So once again, I'm repeating what I've been saying for now 2 years and a half. The problem is not as much that the Russians are going to be good or bad at fighting this war. The problem is that the Russians are going to apply their strengths to counter their weaknesses. And unfortunately, Russian strength is literally throwing as much shit as possible at your face, and while you're choking, they come and fucking finish you off. The Ukrainian strength was to be flying like a bee and stinging, and making it impossible for a concentrated, proper, army-wise make advance. And it's fine, it worked. But now it's different. Now they have to deal with the same kind of slowpoke tactics, small groups, which are grinding their own troops one after the other. And then they cannot reply to that because every single engagement is rather small. It's literally attrition. So the whole logic that we're having with RUSI here is, once again, instead of taking every single part and saying, okay, we got this, and this, and this is the problem, this is the solution, and the solution, unfortunately, is a kind of escalation that nobody's going to afford Western side if we want Ukraine to survive as it stands. No, what is happening right now is that, oh yeah, you know what, they failed the first time, but what we need to give them is that a superiority in everything so the Ukraine can win. And what is the problem with that idea? It's not Israel against fucking Arabs, assholes. It's actually the exact contrary. And this stems from one single fucking point, which is making propaganda for the Ukrainian side. Because if you read all the fucking analysis that has been already said and done by Timur Criminal way before these assholes came by, you would end up with one single conclusion. For Ukraine to win, quote unquote, this war, it would have to be a fucking Russia. Which means have 4 or 5 times the population, have its own fucking fuel, have a fucking huge country with strategic depth, and then we would fucking get this whole point of trying to attract the Russians and then hitting them back. One of the limiting factors, and I said it multiple times, is that in order to save lives, Ukrainians made every single one of their forces smaller, which is that on tactical engagements, small group team engagements, Ukrainians are going to have a lot of fucking GoPro material by shooting Russians in trenches that they've completely debilitated. But on long front side, it's the Ukrainians who are fucking buried under UMPKs. But of course, we don't see people blowing into pieces there, so nothing happens. The Russians are just destroying buildings out of, sheer incompetence. And then the front advances, but we don't know how. We don't know why the Ukrainians are fleeing as well. It's magic. We don't know. I'm sorry, guys. In few words, RUSI goes to the fucking well, but still doesn't drink from it. And this is why a lot of these people are so toxic and so problematic in the Western academia. There is this whole fucking axiomatic neutrality, which means that you need to analyze things as they are without taking sides. But they start by taking sides. Because they say, oh, we're not going to blame anyone here. And then they write this disgusting report based on their own fucking data, their own Ukrainian data. But at the end, they still not fucking pointing out that, okay, you know what, guys, you're fucked. No. What they say that, no, we need to actually make the Ukrainians be Hyperboreans or something. Orcs versus owls, all this bullshit. It's exactly that. What they're trying to say is that Ukraine needs to be so well armed and have such an advance that it wouldn't matter that it is fucking overmatched 5-1 or 10-1 at the front. And in a certain sense, the use of FPVs leads people to believe that it is the case. But it's not. That's the fucking problem. It's really not. What happens is that when you see 10, 15, 20 FPVs hit their fucking marks, you get one fucking MPK to level the whole fucking building. And then you discover obituaries like 5-10 days after, and like, wait, I thought you guys were rocking. What the fuck happened? And then their own fucking cells that communicate everything from the highway where they get attacked by Russian FPVs that we don't see, fucking assholes don't show them until 2 or 3 weeks have passed, and you're like, okay, you already got the point. What is this? And to the losses, you got the confirmed losses of a whole headquarters, and you're like, what? What's going on? What is this? So once again, I know it was extremely long, I'm going to finish with this. The biggest problem with the analysis at RUSI is that after lining up a lot of arguments that, of course, I'm going to repeat, if you followed me, I've already spoken about these in real time, and we saw them at Timor Criminal in real time, and we even fucking wargamed that before it happened, especially, as I said, when you had the full list following the leaks of what was going to be given. And then we knew, I said, the Orbat is fucked up. Other people in the group said this is not enough even to fire enough rounds to basically kill off Russian artillery. And now you have this analysis when the Ukrainian general staff puts the Russian artillery barrels at 720, and you're like, okay, and you were going to do what with 100 something? Especially how you are using them, especially how you are forced them to use the HIMARS to actually stop the Russians from wrecking the shit out of you. I'm going to follow this up because I went too far with this, but I'm going to follow up this tomorrow with analysis of the latest thread from Konar Muzika on what he expects next from Ukraine, and where he's absolutely adamant that Ukrainians need to be cautiously optimistic about what's going to happen in later this year and next year. I'm going to tell you that it's complete mind-blowing madness, because a lot of the arguments that he's giving in that thread literally point out to the contrary, but it's going to be the follow-up to this. This was just RUSI fumbling, probably the easiest self-criticism that I've seen. And that's it, guys. If you want to intervene, it's up to you now. Yeah, okay, Kremlin, it's up to you, man.
Hey guys, yeah, I'm gonna be an asshole and take a little bit of your time. You made a point initially, when with the when Zelensky came up, what was it in March, I think this year, and it's like, oh, we have only 31,000 deaths, right?
Yeah, it's in February. Actually,
Yeah, February,
the
and
24th February 2024. It was
exactly like
yeah.
2 years, exactly two
Yeah,
years,
yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah. It was
And
for the anniversary, yes.
And you know what the funny thing is? I remember explicitly because I was arguing with one of now ex friends because, reality was too much for him to handle. Zelensky in August 2022, before the mobilization, right? They he came on TV and officially said that while they were trying to do their whole Kherson offensive, that they were losing. So let's suppose it's killed and wounded in action, close to 1,000 people a day, and he said that like 2 weeks in a row or more than that.
Yeah,
So
David Darakamia came with that number as well. I can confirm. I even posted a mocking thread about that, about how it wasn't possible. But yeah, go on.
yeah, yeah, exactly, and that's the exact bullshit that we keep saying about these people get tangled in their own lies. They say for about 2 months straight, August and September 2022, that they're losing, right? So let's give it the positive advantage. Maybe it means wounded and killed in one uh, combined, one close to 1,000 people a day. So they definitely have 200 dead a day, right? And if
Yeah,
you do that
yeah.
for 2 months, that's like 12,000 dead. Over.
Yes.
You're telling me that just before the mobilization, 2 months, you got over 10,000 deaths, and then the rest of the war, the rest of the 22 months, you only got 20,000. Motherfucker. Like,
Yes, of
please.
course, of course. But this is the thing that I always point out to the pro-Ukrainian crowd is that wherever the Russian lie, because of course that's what I said. Both sides in this war have chosen to not even make it believable. The Ukrainians lie worse, and with implications for the Ukrainians are worse than for the Russians, and we're seeing the results now. Yeah, please go on. Sorry, I interrupted you.
Yeah, yeah, don't worry about that. Yeah, and it's absolutely crazy. And right now, like, we're in the stage, at least in the last 2 to 3 weeks, if you look at the propaganda, the pro-Ukrainian channels, what they're throwing out, they're not even like looking at the battlefield anymore. It's basically like, how should I put it? Their wins, quote unquote, are the fact that they're throwing leaflets or some shit like that in
Crimea.
Crimea. Bro, it's just crazy, man. Like it's kind of like saying, I just discovered this really nice book by a Ukrainian author. This is the W, right? It's just crazy. And right now, today, I don't know if you guys saw this. They're retrying the whole bullshit on hitting refineries. Like they sent out, I think it was like 50 drones or more, and only one of them actually hit something,
The
right?
thing is that the problem is that with the refineries part is even worse because when you see where they're striking, for some reason, despite the fact that their drones can fly 800, 900 kilometers, they're still sticking to a roughly 300 kilometers range post the line or 400 kilometers range post the line. That because it gives them time enough to be effective and make them fly during the dusk, and then also have the possibility to have BDA by, of course, Russians that are filming these drones. But the thing is that they are still trying to hit the same things that they hit before, which means that either they don't have the capability, either they have been demanded, requested to stop that shit. But one of the things that is happening on air bases now is that they're eating the Avgas tank farms. They are not even trying the planes anymore, and we saw that with Milerovo. They went for the repair hub, they went for the Avgas, and one apparently landed not far from the ammunition dugout. So in that aspect, we are regressing into a strategic planning that, in my opinion, is aimed at having something else from the West. And when I say that, it's literally more lethal weapons with more range. Because, like, if they could go as usual and hit these refineries, all these places with their drones, that would, in a certain sense, have the Western powers that don't want to escalate, especially the Germans, but also the Americans, especially now, because it's going to be a threshold. Americans, for all the bark, they understand what the threshold is. And the threshold is that once Tomahawks start to fly from Ukraine towards Russia, and Ukrainians themselves are jubilant about how their Neptune is going to fly 1,000 kilometers. I'm like, bring it on, man, no problem, go on. But it's not there. The whole point is that it's not there. All these bullshit announcements that Ukrainians have done for so long have been limited when we see the reality as basically copying the Shahid in a way or another. When it comes to the Liu drones, it's literally the format and the design of the Bayraktar TB2, and that's it. If the Ukrainians had, because they had the time, they had the leisure, they have the means of it, they cannot not even develop their own bomb kits. We are 2 years and a half in this war, and the industry had some of these bullshit bomb kits that looked a lot like the Russian ones in 2005. They're just not there. They are literally living off donations from France and from the US. And this makes it a whole different ballgame because, as I said, you are a recipient. At some point, it's going to stop, not because they don't want to give to you, but simply because of the logistical chain. And if the tempo of operations goes up, you're going to expend more. That's what happened with the HIMARS at some point. It's not that much that the HIMARS got destroyed. It's simply that they couldn't fire enough to stop the Russians. And we're seeing it right now. At some point as well, they had some losses with the HIMARS, which were, in my opinion, shown by the fact that the Germans delivered 3 more M270 or Mars, whatever that was. And then we go back to attacks against exposed air defenses, of which they're more or less do nothing to defend above what they need to supposed to do, because they take out one S300, S400 in Lugansk, but there will never be a F-16 operating 90 kilometers in Lugansk Oblast. So the whole point is to just facilitate deep strikes, be that by weapons from the F-16 or by drones. But the, how can I say, the exploitation of that strike is weeks or months in the coming. So the Russians will have the time to replace it. And this is what I mean from the problem of attrition on the Ukrainian side, is that they're not doing enough damage, and they will not be able to do enough damage unless the Americans decide this war needs to be upended. But then you got another ladder of escalation on the Russian side, which means that we're going to enter, as I said, usually in a path to perdition, a road to perdition. And in a certain sense, I couldn't even blame the Russians if that happened. Because, as I said, usually nobody gave caliber to the Taliban. Nobody gave Sukhoi 57 to the Iraqis. So what the fuck are you even talking about? When you try to explain that somehow Ukraine has the right to self-defense, I agree with that. But not only Ukraine, a lot of people have the right to self-defense. So where does the buck stop? And this is the core problem that everyone understands, including the Americans. But in a certain sense, everybody is now caught in their posturing, in their lies, and also in this inextricable position where the critical mass is doing its effect. The Russians, with all the problems, all the mistakes they've committed all over the campaign, are still slowly turning this into exactly what they wanted. A grinding match where Ukraine's military forces are going to be put to the brink of collapse. It's going to take it 6 months, a year, 2 years, 5 years, 12 years. It will not matter. For as long as it would remain at this same level of losses and of cost, Russia can fucking manage. What Russia cannot manage is if someone decides that it wants to play, you know, kingmaker, and then we are entering, as I said, a completely different paradigm, and there are no layouts for what's going to happen. Sorry, I
Yeah,
overspoke.
no, don't worry, don't worry. It's all good. Yeah, I agree. Like, this is the essential problem: is that all these countries in the West, they never like wanted to commit enough. Like, they always thought, oh, okay, we're gonna give them a little bit more and see what. But at the end of the day, it's kind of like, it's about force. Like, if you slap a door a million times, it's not never gonna have the effect of like one big kick, right?
Yes.
That's essentially what it is. And the problem is, if they want to do that big kick, like, let's just think about it, because I was discussing in another space like this weekend with some friends. Okay, what the fuck do you still have to offer to Ukraine that you haven't offered, right? All the intelligence you're already offering them as if it was like a NATO force, right? In terms of land, anything like what's it called? Armor on the ground. They already received everything that they could receive, right? Not in large numbers, right? Let's say not in large enough numbers, but there's no Wunderwaffe, right? You got the HIMARS, you got
No.
the women, you got everything. The only thing you don't have is in terms of aviation, let's say, right? And maybe like longer range stuff, as in the Tomahawks. Those are actually the only thing, but you'll probably need to have the ground launch ones, of which I think the United States has less than 1,000, about 800 currently. From what I remember in stock, the total number of because the Tomahawk, as you guys know, is basically is launched from vessels, right? And they have in stock about 3,300 or something like that. They're running out of Wunderwaffe to send, that the Russians cannot, let's say, that the Russians will need some time to adapt to. That's it. And yeah, I totally agree with you on one thing. Like, if they decide to provide even longer range stuff, then yeah, you're basically putting yourself in the situation where people can basically escalate to whatever. Okay, you want to start fucking around this way, you want to provide whatever weapons to strike deep inside Russia. Like, even if it really depends on the number. Even they would provide Tomahawks, right? If there's like 50 Tomahawks, like whatever. Okay, you're probably going to have 2, 3 successful strikes somewhere, and that's going to be it, right? Unless you actually put something in, like, and how should I put it? The problem is that giving Ukraine stuff is not enough, because they will not have the people trained to operate those things. So you need to put in the know-how. You're not going to have people that know how to fly F-35s with the latest ASM-120 or whatever, right? They don't have those people. So you have to commit to you're sending your troops in, which like fucking blows up everything, right? Because then the Chinese can be like, oh, sure, so cool story, bro. Like, we just did this training in Belarus, right? We're familiar with the plane. Why should we go in?
No, I completely agree with you, but the biggest issue is at the end of the day, let's see the most. I mean, there is an argument going right now with geolocation. I don't know if you guys are following, but there is this raid in Ivano-Darivka, and the actual point is being disputed that the village has been taken by the Russians, and we have discussing with James Retarded Ford that is probably the most useless piece of shit since the Syrian war. The geolocation that he purportedly proposes as a say proof that the Ukrainians are still in the village is something that's over 800 meters beyond the village, on a ridge that literally can be the limit between both forces. It doesn't disprove anything, and it's exactly what's going on with the Ukrainian side right now. It's a more general argument here. They are in denial, and this denial, as I said, is pretty funny because the footage is from the 18th of July, We are the 22nd. The flag in Ivano-Darivka was shown up, I think, the 20th. So basically, according to the retard in question, these 2 days, they are not enough, first of all, to clear the part there, but also the location doesn't justify absolutely not putting into contradiction who has control over this shitty village. And it could be a lateral push with a small pocket in the south. It doesn't really actually matter. But what matters is that these people have pushed the delusion way beyond a lot of pro-Russians in September 2022, where they are literally ready to declare the earth flat just so they would not recognize they are fucking in the shit. And I think this is the most dangerous part when it comes to Ukraine right now. Ukrainians themselves, they know how bad the situation is. And they know also where they're going with this. And it's not a surprise that they're asking for the Patriot complement of whole fucking Europe. Literally 25 batteries on top of the 5 they're supposed to have is literally, I think, a third of what America has.
No, it's actually more than a third. The Americans have currently 60 batteries deployed all across the world.
Yeah, so like what the fuck, man? And this is the delusion level that we're having from the Ukrainian side. And at the end, it will not matter who the tactical, strategical, operational parts of this. It will not matter, because what matters at this moment, especially for the Ukrainians, is their capability to eat shit, smile, and say that it was a perfect chocolate cake. I know that aspect because Russians were there almost 2 years ago. I mean, how many people weren't in PLS in fucking half coma when the bridge fell down and everybody with a reflux back from Kherson, everybody was dooming as hell. But the Ukrainians have this capability of seeing 3 times as much losses in territory and crucial and critical points on the map, and still having the audacity to tell you, oh, it's nothing. Trading land for time is perfect. And I'm like, yes, the problem is that the objectives on the other side, so basically the Russian objectives, are not to take over all of fucking Ukraine, you fucking motherfuckers. They're just to kick you out of Donbass for starters, and then starting to impose this multiple front attritional war where you at some point, either you tap out, either you're going to get caught with your pants down, a bit what happened in the Cheretino, a bit what happened in Avdiivka, and what's going to remain is you trying to do this shuttle coverage with the few new divisions that you're going to have, but north, south, and east. The whole problem right now is that nobody wants to understand this. What they want to understand is that hope dies last, and that Ukraine somehow, given Kharkov and Kherson, is going to prevail. And this is the kind of misconception you find on the RUSI preview or review as well. They can see what went wrong, but they cannot put the pieces together and say, okay, the problem is far more strategic, far more general, and we have a huge issue that we need to cover. And it's saying that, oh, the allies need to assist Ukraine as long as it needs, is not going to cut it. You need to put numbers, you need to put a cost. And the fact that that cost is not presented is exactly because nobody would like to pay that cost. So far, over 300 billion has been pledged to Ukraine. And the results for it is a rather stalled defense, which is slowly crumbling. And in order to restore the capability to have these Ukrainian forces be far more proficient and so forth and so on, you need at least, as I said, another 300 billion to have a second army that you can sustain. The problem is that the economy of Ukraine cannot sustain that. So at certain point, I start to be in agreement with Azov goons who say that, we don't need the economy. We just ask money from abroad. We put everybody under the fucking flag and we send them to attack. Point. And I completely agree with that, given the limitations of what equipment can be procured by the Western allies. In a certain sense, it will have to be a mid-wave attack, a real one, not like the Russians do. And this coincides as well to what Budanov said from September 2023. If there is an offensive from the Ukrainian side, it will have to be foot mobile. And that's the funny part. These people who are fucking professional Russophobes, who are assholes, they are telling the truth for the situation where Ukraine is standing right now. Other people who are smart and who supposedly have degrees and who supposedly are there to give nuance are just selling bullshit to everyone, including the Ukrainians. And this, in my opinion, is wrong. And that was the whole point of this space today. And I'm not even saying that it's a good thing or a bad thing to have a high morale or try to boost that morale. The point is that, as with many boost pieces, this is just going to get people killed for no other result. So that's it. Sorry, guys.
Yeah, like I totally agree with it. Like it's okay to have high morale as long as there's a chance. If there's no chance, then it's kind of like me saying, "Oh, I'm gonna jump from the 20th store onto I don't know the concrete uh, sidewalk, right? But
Yes.
I think I can survive this. I think I should be good, right? No, you're gonna fucking die, right? So yeah, one more point I wanted to make about this, the FPVs. Honestly, I think this is kind of like the big game changer, so to speak, in all the war. Like the fact that you have these fucking annoying little things that cost very little, and they're a pain in the ass because, like, yeah, you could have like total air dominance, whatever the fuck, right? But every war, even like these wars that the Americans won, or at least they claim they won, end of the day, they still needed to put troops on the ground, like people,
Yes.
infantry, right? And
Yes.
these motherfucking FPVs, like, really are a pain for the infantry. And currently, like, we're not seeing from any side any proper solution. Like, people are only kind of mitigating losses in a way. Like, what the Russians are doing now, like, for all the shit that they're getting from, oh, look, they don't have any more armored vehicles, they're on dirt bikes. Motherfucker, yeah, that's very good. Those bikes are fucking cheap and they provide most of what that armor should provide. High mobility. Like, that's what you need, right? Yeah, honestly, I would
Yes, no.
advocate that.
They also forced an expenditure of the FPVs because we've seen the problem with the design of a lot of Soviet armored vehicles is that they have weaknesses like every other vehicle out there. But with one FPV hitting the right place, you can fry the whole vehicle and the whole guys on top of it. With the bikes, you're going to have one or two guys per bike. And with 20 bikes, you have 40 guys. But to kill everybody, you would need at least 20 FPVs, right? To kill 20 guys in two BMPs, you will need 4. In a certain sense, this is the fucking cynical calculus that has been made. And I'm pretty sure that the Russians understand, and that's why they are pushing it. Same thing for the desert crosses that everybody's mocking. Yes, it's true, there is no armor. Yes, it's true, the consequences when the FPV hits are pretty bad. But the point is that it's fast, it can have a lot of uh, storage space, and most importantly, it's cheap. And it goes everywhere compared to using a pickup from the civilian sector and trying to use it as a military vehicle. And we see that the smallest damage to it gonna fuck up your engine, gonna make your tires go completely off. So basically, the whole 4x4 and the capability to go beyond the damage is completely zero. So on that aspect, that you are on desert cross or a pickup truck, it's exactly the same thing. And I agree with you. Right now, the problem with the FPVs is that they are limiting and putting a leash on Russian advances. But once again, they are limiting these advances because the Russians still have the means to counter it by numbers, sheer numbers and speed. I'm not sure that Ukrainians can do the same. I'm not sure that Ukrainians being submitted to the same 20, 30, 40, 50 FPVs on light-skinned vehicles, if they are on the assault, are going to be able to take the punishment that the Russians are taking for so long. And just the same problem. As you said, the dirt bikes are a good solution to a bad problem. And they are based on basically the most cynical vision of warfare, which is we're going to lose men, the point is to lose the least possible. But you know that on the 10 guys that are going to start the attack, you're going to lose 2, 3, 4, 5. Having this mindset, it's true, it's very uncallous actually, but the problem with it is that you don't have the leisure to completely dominate the battle space. Otherwise, you would not do it. Otherwise, if you had this leisure, you would do exactly what happened a couple of times at the start of the campaign, when the Russians completely dominated the passages. They went through in Kherson, they went through in parts of Zaporizhia, they went through towards Kryvyi Rog, and then at some point they stopped because there was the limit to what they could expand without losing too much logistical capability. And that's the whole point here. That's what I'm saying since the beginning. This war has already returned to this very cynical aspect to which there is no recourse for the moment. And even if one of the sides, like let's say the Russians find a solution more or less to the FPV problem, something else is going to pop out again. And it seems that that's something else going to be auto-tracked FPV. So even if you have some kind of APS that takes out 60, 70, 80% of those, you can still have those 10, 20% extra. That would do a lot more damage than they should do, you know. The problem with FPVs, as you said, is cheap, and right now it's a reliable mean of destruction, even if you have the electronic warfare, because we see the Russians drop multiple dozens of them per week. At least 20, 30, 40%, 50% find still a target. So I think when it comes to one spectrum defense for that problem, we have reached the maximum that can be done, because the whole game of the FPVs, especially on the Ukrainian side, given that a fuck ton of people are making them in a way or another, and on that the Ukrainians are right. The fact that they have this still boutique production, they can afford to have completely different range of frequencies to use them. Whereas the more, I'd say, standardized and more efficient production on the Russian side is going to end up with, well, a couple of frequencies. And the moment the Ukrainians strike the good frequency, they're going to strike gold because of the serialized production. Now, the problem with this in general is that the Ukrainians enjoy these boutique advancements, those niche advantages for a while, and when they go away, not directly even, because sometimes, you know, like they had this huge advantage with Excalibur, and at some point apparently Excalibur went to shit. Whereas the Russians still are using Krasnopol to this day, and it's still highly effective. Same for UMPKs. The Russians had huge problems with bombing because most of the guided projectiles were of the missile type with EO or radar. But now with the GPS functions that they developed thanks to the Shahid GPS boards, it has to be said as well, well, they have no problem. They just fucking drop them, and whatever is in their path is going to be killed. And whereas super accurate or less accurate, the destructive power they drop with this stuff is just mind-blowing high. And given how far they are right now, that they are roughly at 16,000, on the half year, they're going to be probably at 32,000, 35,000 at the end of the year. You can only imagine, as I said, if you just take one person, you kill one and you wound two with it, you are looking at 100,000 casualties only through UMPKs. And the Ukrainians themselves are saying, our problem, forget FPVs, forget drones, the problem is the UMPK. They ground the defenses, they move after them, and that's it. And this is what I want to tell. I think the solution that's going to found for these things is going to be completely different.
Yeah, I kind of agree on that. Like, the end of the day, like, you're going to use these FPVs, right? But you have to have like a group of people over there. You're going to have a nest, so to speak. And if you don't have the proper mobility to just like move the people from that nest, the troops one place to another, you're going to get hit with something, and UMPK or whatever, right? And you're going, and basically it's like, it's a numbers game, right? It's a numbers game. Like, okay, how many nests, whatever you're going to have on the battlefield, I'm going to hit the vast majority of them, or the bigger ones, with UMPKs. I'm going to send in infantry on motorbikes, on dirt bikes, and yeah, you're probably going to have some people left with some drones, right? FPVs. Some of them are going to hit because whatever, right? Not everybody on the bike is going to be able to dodge them or whatever. So, but at the end of the day, we're going to gain ground, and we're going to gain ground and gain ground, and that's it. But honestly, I'm just going to say one more thing, and that's it. There was like this news, I think, a couple of days ago. Even I actually chimped out a lot about having at least a minimum sort of, not necessarily I would say it is a sort of defense if you think about it, for aircraft. Like, bro, I'm actually glad that Belousov said this. Like, yeah, we're going to start doing something. I'm not saying that you have to do concrete hangars or whatever, but bro, like, at least make it difficult for these motherfuckers to not see these via satellite imagery, right? Just put some fucking sheets of steel somewhere all over the place and make it so that for the Ukrainians it's going to be kind of like playing the lotto. Oh, we're going to, I don't know, we get like 100 locations where there may be some planes. We're going to hit some. And maybe there's a plane under it, maybe not. It's a whack-a-mole.
Yeah, I understand, but see what they did. That's the problem when people think on one only point, and I agree there has to be some kind of concealment, shelter, whatever. But now they don't even care about if there is a plane or not. First of all, on at least two bases, they started to attack the Afghan systems. So instead of taking out the planes, they are reducing your capability to fly from those air bases. And what are you going to do? Are you going to put also concrete over the Afghan cisterns? Of course, there are solutions. You can put them underground and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, it just shows that you don't have causal solutions to this kind of problems. Your main issue is still the same. You got the AD problem, especially when it comes to the drones themselves. It's not like you have calibers or tomahawks or whatever. What you're having is a highly penetrative threat that is being mostly guided by interference and EW and SIGINT that the Americans and NATO is picking up on your area. And they are spawning these multiple dozen drones, and it doesn't matter now if they lose 40 out of 50 for as long as one or two is passing. And this is the whole point that I was trying to convey to everyone. The hardened shelters are nice if your threat remains that low, but we're seeing that now even the Ukrainians themselves are starting to be smart enough. If they cannot hit your planes, or if the damage at your planes with those drones is not going to be conclusive, they're going to hit the next best thing. Next best thing is going to be your mechanicians, your weapons, your fuel. Or the other time, maybe they're going to have these, going to attack your ATC tower and so on. So the point is, once again, you have an AD issue, and that you protect your assets, but cannot still shoot down most of the drones. And in this case, of course, it's going to be like that, because at the end, for the Ukrainians, spending, I don't know, 100,000 to make these shitty drones and have thousands of them, or starting to train 200,000 people and have them mowed down within 2 to 3 months, the choice is easy. It's better to have that hindrance on you, augment that cost, so basically refineries, plants, substations, power plants, operating systems on your airfield, air bases, and that's it. It's always a kind of sword against shield, and the problem right now is that you don't have the shield that would matter against the sword. So burying yourself or burying your head under the ground in a certain sense, yes, it's going to help, but it's not going to stop these assholes from just spawning this shit every time.
Yeah,
So
yeah, but like what I don't understand, like the obvious solution, like the easiest solution for these drones is the cheapest thing would be man pads, right?
yes,
Why are the Russians like mass producing man pads and actually doing a system, right? Because you don't want to have some fucking mobic sitting around every at 24 hours around these, and have like a fucking system that can recognize the flying object and fucking hit it.
actually the problem is it's even simpler. You have currently about a fleet of at least 25 to 50 let's say Orions that are not being used on strike roll except on rare occasions. Just as you said, equip your electro-optical package with a connection to your Verba, Igla, whatever, and just have these assholes fly over because the manpads are rather light. So instead of having only 2 or 3 cornets for ground strikes, you just you know create a 4 like a flying strela, and you just start taking them one to one. On top of it, the Orion and the Lute have exactly the same speed when they're fairing, so it's not going to be a huge problem if you have your radar up to intercept them without risking pilots and planes, you know. But this is also one thing that I said. The problem with the Russians is that maybe it's already happening because at least for the seaborne drones, the Russians are obviously using the Orion for both detection and strikes. But where is it for the rest of it? And this is going to remain the biggest problem with the Russians, is a uneven understanding of what they're doing and why they're doing them. For instance, why are they not putting shelters after 2 years? I said because at the end of the day, we saw what are doing, what the Ukrainians are doing. They cannot hit the plates. They're going to start hit everything else that matters on the airfield. And even if you manage to drop 90 to 95% of the drones, what they're going to do is find other softer targets or just throw more shit at you. And at the end of the day, as I said, it's still extremely cheap to spawn like 1,000 of these drones instead of training 100,000 people to go ahead and get mowed to regain the territory. The whole point with Ukraine right now, at least on this aspect, is that strategy of tension that they've chosen for the borderland Russia is going to work at some point. People are going to get fed up. We had this situation with Krasnodar because of the Rostov NPP, but it's logical because if it works against them, it's going to work for them as well. So the whole point that I was wanting to point out here is that the solutions that the Russians need to find for the war that is happening right now are twofold. First of all, limit their own exposure, and two, allow them to reduce the value for the Ukrainians to a point where there have to be desperation attacks. When you see the Ukrainians using FPVs to hit buses with old babushkas or hit firefighters, that shows exactly who the fuck they are and what they have done since the beginning. The point is to paint Ukrainians into a corner where it's morally impossible to defend their actions. So that's why they fucking fight tooth and nail when they fucking commit atrocities, like when they hit a mark in Kramatorsk with an AD missile, and everybody pointed out that it was their fault. Suddenly it became like a huge thing. But they have done that in Donetsk for years. They did that in Donetsk with the fucking Tochka. So that's the whole point. Right now, the point is to vilify Ukraine. So the escalation that they seek backfires to them. All the rest, when it comes to military matters, the Ukrainians are going to do the lowest and the highest. It doesn't matter. They are into this because they think they're going to disappear if they lose. So there is no reasoning with most of them. Okay, guys, thank you very much. It was long, extremely messy. Tomorrow is going to be a bit more succinct because I'm going to go tweet by tweet over Konrad Musica and a couple of other analyses that have been done. Sorry for the long discourse in a certain sense. Thank you very much for being here. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.